Welcome to The Drowsy Historian, where history isn't just about dates and facts, it's about the untold stories, the hidden truths, and the lives of those who lived long before us. Here we dive into the forgotten corners of time, unearth the secrets of the past, and explore the raw, real, and sometimes unsettling realities of history. From the distant worlds of medieval warriors to the quiet lives of forgotten craftsmen, join me as we journey through time, unraveling the threads that tie us to the past. Prepare for a calm, immersive experience, where history isn't just heard, it's felt. Relax, close your eyes and let the history of the world lull you into a dreamlike state of discovery. So sit back, relax, and let the drowsy historian take you on a journey that will leave you with more than just knowledge, but a sense of wonder and reflection about the world that once was. Chapter 1. The Role of a Falconer in the Medieval World. The day began long before the sun's rays touched the ground, in a world where darkness still gripped the earth. In the cold stone tower where he lived, the falconer awoke, his bones stiff and sore from the previous day's work. The room was sparse, bare stone walls, the faint smell of leather and feathers lingering in the air, a few sparse belongings, but mostly the ever-present weight of responsibility. Today, like every day, was another challenge that demanded his complete attention. The falconer did not have the luxury of warmth or comfort. He was a servant of both nature and the nobility, living on the edge of survival. His job, his entire life, was dedicated to the ancient and brutal art of falconry, a profession that demanded both skill and unwavering patience. The birds in his care were not pets. They were creatures of prey: hawks, falcons and eagles, trained to hunt, to kill and to obey only the most skilled of handlers. He was one of the few chosen to manage them, to ensure they remained at their best. He wasn't just a trainer, he was a custodian of an art that symbolized the power, prestige and danger of the medieval world. But this life was not without its costs. As he readied himself, the weight of his task loomed large. His role was not one of luxury, it was a hard, often thankless existence. He didn't work in the grand halls of the noble courts, but rather in the remote parts of the estate, away from the opulence and comfort of the lords and ladies. His quarters were functional at best: no tapestries to hang on the walls, no roaring hearth to chase away the chill, only the endless hours spent with his birds. His life was a solitary one, lived in the shadows of those who ruled. The birds he worked with were treated like royalty, but their handlers, they were mere servants. And it was in this humble and often harsh reality that he found his purpose. Before the birds even stirred, the falconer was already on his feet. His first task, to ensure the safety and readiness of the birds. The birds of prey were kept in large open wooden aviaries, and each one had its own needs, quirks and temperament. The falconer knew them well, having spent countless hours with them over the years. But they were not simple creatures to care for. Falcons and hawks, with their sharp beaks and talons, were not tamed easily. The falconer's work was not about controlling the birds, but understanding them, anticipating their needs, and building a relationship of trust. It was a precarious bond, one that could be broken in an instant. He knew this all too well. A bird that was too wild to train could cost him his job, and a bird that escaped could mean the end of his career. There was always the risk that one of the more powerful birds, a hunting eagle or a stubborn falcon, might take flight without notice, disappearing into the sky, never to return. The falconer's heart would sink when that happened, but he couldn't afford to show weakness. The bird was gone, but the work remained. There was no time for sorrow, only the cold reality of his trade. Falconry was an art that had been passed down through generations. It was reserved for the elite, nobles and royalty, who saw owning a bird of prey as a symbol of their power and sophistication. The falconer's task was to maintain the birds, to train them for the hunt, and to ensure they performed at their best. But for the falconer himself, the rewards were few. They were not treated like the knights or lords they served. Falconers lived in the shadows, performing their work under the constant eye of their masters, who could just as easily discard them if they failed. Their success or failure was tied directly to the birds they cared for. The birds were not just trained to hunt, they were symbols of status, of dominance over nature. A falcon perched on a noble's arm was a sign of wealth, but it was also a sign of mastery over life and death. The falconer was the one who made that possible. Yet for all the grandeur, the falconer's life was one of hardship. The hours were long, often spent in harsh conditions, walking miles across the land in search of game, sometimes climbing trees or scaling rocky outcrops to retrieve a bird that had flown too high or too far. It wasn't just the weather or the physical toll that wore on the falconer, it was the constant danger. The land could be treacherous, whether navigating thick forests, swamps, or fields. The falconer faced countless dangers. Wild animals lurked in the underbrush, ready to ambush the unprepared. The birds of prey too posed a constant risk. A falconer's hand, so often protected by thick leather gloves, was never far from the sharp talons of the bird they were handling. One wrong move, one moment of distraction, and a falcon could inflict a wound severe enough to cripple or even kill the falconer. But despite the risks, the bond between the falconer and his birds was profound. It was more than just a working relationship, it was a matter of survival. The falconer understood the wildness of the birds he cared for. They were not docile creatures, easily swayed by commands. Falcons, hawks, and eagles had minds of their own, shaped by years of hunting, of living on the edge of life and death. And yet in the hands of a skilled falconer, these creatures could perform feats of hunting that would leave even the most skilled warrior in awe. They were not just animals, they were instruments of war, tools of power that could bring down a hare in a single strike, or an entire flock of game birds in seconds. The falconer was the key to unlocking this power. Yet despite the prestige and the skill required, falconers were often treated with contempt. They were low-ranking members of the noble courts, valued only for the birds they cared for. If a falcon failed, the falconer was blamed. If a bird was lost, it was the falconer who faced the consequences. They were expected to work tirelessly, often under the harshest conditions, without the luxury of a comfortable life. But even in the face of these challenges, the falconer's commitment never wavered. For them, falconry was not just a job, it was a way of life, a passion that ran deeper than any monetary reward.
The falconer's life from dawn till dusk was one of meticulous attention to detail. From the moment the first light of day broke, there was no time for idleness. The birds didn't wait, and neither did the needs of the lord or the hunt. This relentless rhythm shaped the falconer's existence. They weren't just caretakers, they were integral to the power structure, albeit in a less glamorous role. The falconer's job was more than just handling birds. It was about crafting a relationship based on trust and respect. A relationship that went beyond the surface. To many, the falcon was a symbol of aristocracy, an emblem of the nobility's dominance over nature. The falconer, however, knew better. Their role was not one of adornment, but of profound responsibility. A falcon, a hawk, or an eagle could not be simply bought and owned. It had to be understood. A falconer's bond with the bird was built over countless hours, sometimes stretching into years. Only through consistent training could the bird be brought to the heights of hunting prowess that it would eventually demonstrate. And that training was often not just physically demanding, it was emotionally draining as well. But the falconer's relationship with the bird was fraught with tension. The bird, majestic and free, had a mind of its own. When a falconer worked with the bird, they were constantly reminded of how little control they truly had. The birds were unpredictable, and the falconer's fate was often at the mercy of their temperament. A bird that was poorly trained or not in the right frame of mind could be lost for days, sometimes never returning to its handler. Yet, no matter how difficult, the bond between the falconer and their bird was undeniable. It was a partnership of necessity. The falconer relied on the bird's ability to bring down prey, and the bird relied on the falconer for food, safety, and a stable environment. Each bird had its quirks. Some were calm and disciplined, others were aggressive and wild. The falconer had to adapt, often on the fly, learning to manage each bird's unique traits. But even a single moment of failure could cost them dearly. A bird that refused to return to its handler, flying off into the wilderness, was not just a lost asset, it was a lost investment. The falconer's reputation was tied to the bird's performance, and any failure was personal. But while the falconer's relationship with the birds was deeply personal, their relationship with their noble patrons was anything but. The falconer, despite their vital role, was often treated as little more than a servant. Their lives were governed by the whims of the nobility they served. If a falconer failed to train a bird properly, it wasn't just the bird that suffered, it was the falconer's livelihood. These skilled artisans and caretakers could lose their position in the blink of an eye, replaced by someone else who might offer a fresher approach or a better track record. The falconer's station in life was precarious. Despite the critical role they played in the noble courts, their existence was one of quiet struggle. They were expected to be experts in their craft, able to respond to any challenge presented by both the bird and the hunt. Yet their compensation rarely matched the value they brought to the table. Falconers worked with birds that could determine the success or failure of a hunt, and that meant their work was essential. But for many falconers, the rewards were sparse. What most people didn't realize was how dangerous the work was. Falconers didn't simply take care of their birds, they were often required to go on hunts themselves. They would venture into forests, over fields and across rivers, navigating difficult terrain in search of prey. Whether they were tracking hares, pheasants, or small game birds, the falconer's task was one of constant vigilance. The landscape, while picturesque, was also perilous. Thorny thickets and muddy bogs could easily trip up an unwary falcon. A misstep could mean a sprained ankle or worse, an injury that could end a career. Then there were the dangers from wildlife. While the birds of prey were powerful and deadly, they were not invincible. Falcons and hawks could face threats from other predators, such as wild boars, foxes, and even other birds of prey. Falcons could be knocked out of the sky by larger birds, while eagles could fall prey to the cunning of a hunting wolf. Falconers needed to be prepared for these threats, to keep a sharp eye out for any sign of danger. A falconer could not afford to take their eyes off the birds for even a second. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of falconry was the relationship between the falconer and the bird itself. While falcons and hawks were trained to hunt with precision, they were still wild animals at heart. One wrong movement, an unintended gesture, or a sudden noise, and the bird could lash out, striking with its powerful talon. A falconer's life was constantly at risk, not just from nature or the birds they worked with, but from their own inability to control them in times of stress. Despite the tension, falconers were expected to remain calm. The noble class relied on falconry for sport, for hunting, and for ceremonial purposes. The presence of a well-trained falcon was a symbol of the ruler's power. A falconer's skill could bring glory to a lord, and failure could bring disgrace. This expectation of perfection added weight to an already difficult profession. The birds themselves, while symbols of wealth and status, were also incredibly difficult to train. The falconer had to work tirelessly to teach them to respond to commands, to fly at specific targets, and to come back on command. Each bird had its own temperament, which meant that a falconer had to adjust their methods accordingly. The pressure was for some it was a matter of life and death. The beauty of falconry lay in its grace and precision. The birds would soar through the air with incredible speed, their keen eyes scanning the landscape for prey. The falconer standing below would hold their breath as they watched the bird dive, swooping down to catch its target in a single strike. It was a moment of triumph, a victory of both bird and hand. But as beautiful as the hunt was, it was also a reminder of how dangerous and fragile the relationship was. A single failure could mean the end of everything. The end of a falconer's career, the loss of a bird, and the humiliation of their lord. The falconer, despite their skill and knowledge, was often an unsung hero. They lived in the shadows of the nobility, working tirelessly to keep the birds in top condition, to ensure the success of the hunt. Their life was one of service, sacrifice, and constant vigil. And yet, despite the risks, the dangers, and the harsh conditions, the falconer's bond with their birds was something that many could not understand. It was a bond built on trust, patience, and a deep understanding of the wild. But for the falconer, it was a life that few would ever truly comprehend. In a world of war, politics, and power, they were the silent guardians of an ancient art, a profession that required not just physical strength, but an inner resolve, a connection to the birds that transcended simple control. It was a life lived on the edge, where the reward was not wealth or fame, but something far deeper. The quiet satisfaction of knowing that for a brief moment in time, man and bird were one.
Chapter 2: The Life of a Falconer. The life of a medieval falconer was a world of both privilege and hardship, a dichotomy that few outside the noble courts could truly appreciate. As dawn broke over the horizon, the falconer rose from his straw-filled bed, the cold stone floor of his humble chamber, a reminder that luxury was a distant dream. Despite the prestige of his work, the falconer's life was far from comfortable. His hands, though skilled in handling the nobility's prized birds, were roughened by years of wear. His clothes, while functional, were often worn thin by the constant labor of caring for both the birds and the estates they inhabited. He did not have the luxury of sleep, the warmth of a grand hall, or the security of a quiet life. Instead, he lived in the shadows of the court, a servant to both the birds he loved and the noblemen who required his services. His morning began with the birds, long before the first sounds of the court stirred from their slumber. The falconer's quarters were rarely close to the heart of the castle. Instead, he was stationed in the far corners of the estate, perhaps in a small stone hut or a barn, where he could keep his birds in relative peace. The cries of falcons, hawks, and eagles echoed through the cold mornings, their wings stretching as they awaited the day's training. The falconer's job was far from simple. Training a bird of prey was no less than an art. Each bird had its own temperament, quirks, and needs. Some were calm, capable of sitting quietly on their perch, while others were wild and unpredictable, making every session an exercise in patience and resilience. A falconer had to know when to push the bird, when to let it have its space, and when to accept that the hunt might not be successful that day. Birds of prey could be stubborn and defiant, unwilling to follow commands or venture into the air when expected. It was a constant struggle to maintain control while still fostering the bird's natural instincts. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the falconer would begin his daily rounds, checking the health of each bird, making sure they were well fed and prepared for the day's work. The birds were carefully kept in cages or aviaries, their wings clipped to ensure they would not fly too far. They were creatures of immense power, capable of hunting game from miles away, but they were also temperamental, with sharp talons and beaks that could kill with the slightest provocation. At this point, the falconer's day would truly begin. He would begin with the easiest of tasks, perhaps calling upon one of the smaller birds to hunt in the surrounding grounds. But as the day progressed, the challenges would become more intense. Falconry was not just about watching birds soar through the sky. It was about managing these birds, ensuring they did not fly off and guiding them to the proper prey. But the birds did not always cooperate. It was a tiring, soul-crushing job, filled with long hours and little rest. And yet, despite the overwhelming challenges, the falconer found a strange satisfaction in the work. The bond between falconer and bird was not easily explained. It was something deeper, something visceral. The falconer's work wasn't just about maintaining the birds and ensuring they were healthy. It was also about training them. Birds of prey were not easily controlled. Unlike domestic animals, they did not obey commands simply because they were told to. The falconer had to build a trust with the bird, one painstakingly formed over long hours of training. The birds would initially resist, unwilling to listen to commands or respond to the falconer's subtle cues. But over time, with patience and practice, the bird would begin to understand. The falconer would train them to return to the arm when called, to wait silently, and to dive upon their prey at a moment's notice. It was a symbiotic relationship, though not one without immense risk. One of the greatest dangers for a falconer was the moment when a bird escaped its handler's grasp. It happened all too often, whether due to a mistake in the training or simply the bird's refusal to obey. If a falconer lost their bird, it could be gone for days, sometimes never to return. The consequences were dire. A falcon that flew away was not just a loss of a bird, it was a loss of reputation. The falconer could lose their position at court, replaced by another more skilled or more fortunate. Worse, they could be blamed for the falcon's disappearance, even if it was not their fault. For many falconers, this was an inevitable part of the job. Failure, it seemed, was always just one mistake away. But what few realized was how often falconers were forced to make difficult decisions in these moments of failure. The loss of a bird could lead to extreme measures, sometimes even sacrificing another bird to recapture the escaped one, hoping that the latter would respond to the falconer's call. This was not just about pride or reputation. It was about survival. The falconer's place in the court depended on the success of their birds. Failure meant banishment from the noble circles, and for those who depended on their skills for sustenance, it could mean a life of poverty. While many noblemen and their courts reveled in the beauty and grace of the soaring birds, few understood the difficulty of keeping them in check. The falconer's daily work was grueling, requiring not only physical endurance, but a deep understanding of the bird's nature. The birds were powerful, sharp-eyed and fierce, yet the falconer had to be more than just a caretaker. They had to be a teacher, a guide, a protector. They had to understand the way the bird thought, its instinctive behaviors, its quirks, and they had to learn how to manage those elements in the pursuit of the hunt. The challenges were great, but the rewards were great. A successful hunt was an awe-inspiring moment, a testament to the bond between falconer and bird. But even the most well-prepared falconer could face unexpected challenges. The birds themselves were always unpredictable. A falconer could train a bird for weeks, yet it could still fail to deliver when it was most needed. There were other elements in play: wind, weather, and the varying conditions of the land that could affect a bird's performance. Sometimes the birds would simply refuse to hunt. They might have been well fed, healthy and trained, but for reasons only they understood, they would decide not to cooperate. And in those moments the falconer was left with nothing but frustration and the looming fear of failure. For the falconer, each day brought with it a new set of challenges. The job was not one that allowed for rest or complacency. It was a constant battle against nature,
against the birds themselves and against the uncertainty that came with working with such wild creatures. The falconer's life was one of constant vigilance, where even the slightest mistake could lead to catastrophic consequences. And yet, despite it all, the falconer remained, bound by their duty to the birds, to the hunt, and to the noble courts that relied on their skill.
The falconer's life was a delicate balance of patience, skill, and relentless endurance. While the birds were often treated like the true royalty of the medieval estate, the falconers themselves remained as humble as the fields they traversed. Their daily existence was shaped by the whims of nature, the nobility, and the birds they cared for. But what the courts and the nobility failed to see was the immense pressure weighing on the falconer's shoulders. The beauty of the hunt, the grace of the soaring birds, and the joy of the noble guests, all of these moments were inextricably tied to the falconer's unseen struggle. It wasn't enough to simply have a bird. To be a falconer was to devote yourself entirely to the mastery of these creatures. It meant waking before dawn, carrying with you the knowledge of how to work with a bird of prey, the understanding that you were not in control, but merely guiding these wild, untamed forces of nature. Every movement had to be precise, every decision made with care. The birds were sharp, quick to react to the smallest gesture, the slightest change in the air, and this meant that even the most seasoned falconers had to stay alert at all times, lest their birds be lost or worse, turn on them in a moment of vulnerability. The process of training these powerful creatures wasn't a matter of brute strength or simple commands. It was a matter of coaxing them to understand and trust their handler. And trust, in the world of birds of prey, was a fleeting thing. It took years to develop a relationship with the birds, years spent watching them, learning their every behavior and reaction. But no matter how skilled, no matter how experienced a falconer became, there were always unknowns. Every bird had its own temperament, and even the best trained birds could turn unpredictable at the slightest disturbance. It was a constant game of patience, perseverance, and trust, and it was a game that the falconer could never afford to lose. The training itself was grueling. Falcons, hawks, and eagles were not animals that took kindly to the human touch. They were not domesticated, like dogs or horses. They were creatures of the wild, born to soar freely in the skies. The falconer's job was not to tame them, but to create a partnership built on understanding. Each bird had its own rhythm, its own natural instincts, that had to be respected. The falconer had to learn the bird's body language, understand when it was in the mood to hunt, and recognize when it needed rest. It was a constant balancing act, one that required a depth of knowledge that few could fathom. But even after months, sometimes years of training, success was never guaranteed. The bond between falconer and bird was fragile. The falconer might have spent hours, days, or even weeks perfecting their bird's flight patterns, teaching it to swoop down on prey with deadly accuracy, but one mistake could destroy that bond. A moment of miscommunication, an accidental command, or even an unexpected environmental factor could send the bird flying off, lost to the winds, never to return. The falconer's heart would sink at such a loss, but there was no time for mourning. The job had to continue. There was always the next bird, the next hunt, the next challenge. It wasn't just the birds themselves that presented difficulties. The landscape was just as dangerous. Falconers didn't simply care for their birds. They had to keep up with them during hunts. Whether in dense forests, across wide open plains, or over steep cliffs, the falconer had to be as quick and agile as the birds they trained. They had to navigate difficult terrains, where a slip of the foot could mean injury, or worse. Falconers were often called upon to climb trees, or scale cliffs to retrieve a bird that had flown too high or too far. The life of a falconer was one of constant physical exertion, moving from one location to another, following the birds through thick underbrush, up rocky hills, or across rushing rivers. The work was exhausting, both physically and mentally, but the falconer had no choice but to push through, and then there were the animals they had to contend with. Falcons and eagles might be fierce, but they weren't invincible. They had their enemies, and so did the falconer. Wolves, foxes, and even wild boars were known to attack falcons, or the falconer himself, if they were not vigilant enough. In these moments, the falconer had to think quickly, responding to danger with the same calm precision that they demanded of their birds. The balance between controlling the bird and protecting it from threats was one that required not only knowledge, but quick reflexes and an unshakable sense of focus. The real danger, however, wasn't always from nature. The falconer's true peril came from the political intrigues of the noble courts. In the medieval world, falconry was an important status symbol. To have a trained bird of prey was to display one's wealth and sophistication. The noblemen who owned these birds rarely understood the difficulties involved in their training. They only saw the bird, majestic, powerful, and capable of bringing down prey with deadly precision. They saw the glory of the hunt, not the endless hours of labor required to make it a success. And when a falconer failed, whether through a lost bird, a missed prey, or a failed training session, the consequences were severe. Disgrace was swift, and those who were once in favor could find themselves cast out, replaced by the next falconer who promised better results. The falconer was at the mercy of the nobleman's whims. The relationship between the two was often one of unequal power. While the falconer relied on the nobleman for food, shelter, and work, the nobleman held all the cards. If the falconer's birds failed to meet expectations, the nobleman would simply replace them. This was the nature of the work, always precarious, always subject to the whims of others.
A falconer could rise to great prominence, trusted by a lord to care for their prized birds, but they could just as easily fall into obscurity if they failed. Despite these challenges, falconers were revered for their skill and dedication. They were seen as masters of a sacred art, a tradition that had been passed down through generations. Their bond with the birds was one of mutual respect, one forged in the fires of countless hours spent in training and devotion. But the life of a falconer was not for everyone. It required a deep connection to nature, an unbreakable will, and the ability to weather endless challenges. And in the end, for all their work and skill, falconers were still servants to the whims of both their birds and their lords. The beauty of the hunt, the thrill of watching a falcon dive toward its prey, was the reward of this grueling profession. But for the falconer, the true triumph was not in the kill, it was in the bond they shared with the bird, the connection they forged with a creature of the wild. It was in the quiet understanding that, despite the dangers and hardships, they had mastered an ancient art, one that tied them to the natural world in a way few could ever understand.
The falconer's life was a delicate balance of patience, skill, and relentless endurance. While the birds were often treated like the true royalty of the medieval estate, the falconers themselves remained as humble as the fields they traversed. Their daily existence was shaped by the whims of nature, the nobility, and the birds they cared for. But what the courts and the nobility failed to see was the immense pressure weighing on the falconer's shoulders. The beauty of the hunt, the grace of the soaring birds, and the joy of the noble guests, all of these moments were inextricably tied to the falconer's unseen struggle. It wasn't enough to simply have a bird. To be a falconer was to devote yourself entirely to the mastery of these creatures. It meant waking before dawn, carrying with you the knowledge of how to work with a bird of prey, the understanding that you were not in control, but merely guiding these wild, untamed forces of nature. Every movement had to be precise, every decision made with care. The birds were sharp, quick to react to the smallest gesture, the slightest change in the air, and this meant that even the most seasoned falconers had to stay alert at all times, lest their birds be lost or worse, turn on them in a moment of vulnerability. The process of training these powerful creatures wasn't a matter of brute strength or simple commands. It was a matter of coaxing them to understand and trust their handler. And trust, in the world of birds of prey, was a fleeting thing. It took years to develop a relationship with the birds, years spent watching them, learning their every behavior and reaction. But no matter how skilled, no matter how experienced a falconer became, there were always unknowns. Every bird had its own temperament, and even the best trained birds could turn unpredictable at the slightest disturbance. It was a constant game of patience, perseverance, and trust, and it was a game that the falconer could never afford to lose. The training itself was grueling. Falcons, hawks, and eagles were not animals that took kindly to the human touch. They were not domesticated, like dogs or horses. They were creatures of the wild, born to soar freely in the skies. The falconer's job was not to tame them, but to create a partnership built on understanding. Each bird had its own rhythm, its own natural instincts, that had to be respected. The falconer had to learn the bird's body language, understand when it was in the mood to hunt, and recognize when it needed rest. It was a constant balancing act, one that required a depth of knowledge that few could fathom. But even after months, sometimes years of training, success was never guaranteed. The bond between falconer and bird was fragile. The falconer might have spent hours, days, or even weeks perfecting their bird's flight patterns, teaching it to swoop down on prey with deadly accuracy, but one mistake could destroy that bond. A moment of miscommunication, an accidental command, or even an unexpected environmental factor could send the bird flying off, lost to the winds, never to return. The falconer's heart would sink at such a loss, but there was no time for mourning. The job had to continue. There was always the next bird, the next hunt, the next challenge. It wasn't just the birds themselves that presented difficulties. The landscape was just as dangerous. Falconers didn't simply care for their birds. They had to keep up with them during hunts. Whether in dense forests, across wide open plains, or over steep cliffs, the falconer had to be as quick and agile as the birds they trained. They had to navigate difficult terrains, where a slip of the foot could mean injury, or worse. Falconers were often called upon to climb trees, or scale cliffs to retrieve a bird that had flown too high or too far. The life of a falconer was one of constant physical exertion, moving from one location to another, following the birds through thick underbrush, up rocky hills, or across rushing rivers. The work was exhausting, both physically and mentally, but the falconer had no choice but to push through, and then there were the animals they had to contend with. Falcons and eagles might be fierce, but they weren't invincible. They had their enemies, and so did the falconer. Wolves, foxes, and even wild boars were known to attack falcons, or the falconer himself, if they were not vigilant enough. In these moments, the falconer had to think quickly, responding to danger with the same calm precision that they demanded of their birds. The balance between controlling the bird and protecting it from threats was one that required not only knowledge, but quick reflexes and an unshakable sense of focus. The real danger, however, wasn't always from nature. The falconer's true peril came from the political intrigues of the noble courts. In the medieval world, falconry was an important status symbol. To have a trained bird of prey was to display one's wealth and sophistication. The noblemen who owned these birds rarely understood the difficulties involved in their training. They only saw the bird, majestic, powerful, and capable of bringing down prey with deadly precision. They saw the glory of the hunt, not the endless hours of labor required to make it a success. And when a falconer failed, whether through a lost bird, a missed prey, or a failed training session, the consequences were severe.
Disgrace was swift, and those who were once in favor could find themselves cast out, replaced by the next falconer who promised better results. The falconer was at the mercy of the nobleman's whims. The relationship between the two was often one of unequal power. While the falconer relied on the nobleman for food, shelter, and work, the nobleman held all the cards. If the falconer's birds failed to meet expectations, the nobleman would simply replace them. This was the nature of the work, always precarious, always subject to the whims of others. A falconer could rise to great prominence, trusted by a lord to care for their prized birds, but they could just as easily fall into obscurity if they failed. Despite these challenges, falconers were revered for their skill and dedication. They were seen as masters of a sacred art, a tradition that had been passed down through generations. Their bond with the birds was one of mutual respect, one forged in the fires of countless hours spent in training and devotion. But the life of a falconer was not for everyone. It required a deep connection to nature, an unbreakable will, and the ability to weather endless challenges. And in the end, for all their work and skill, falconers were still servants to the whims of both their birds and their lords. The beauty of the hunt, the thrill of watching a falcon dive toward its prey, was the reward of this grueling profession. But for the falconer, the true triumph was not in the kill, it was in the bond they shared with the bird, the connection they forged with a creature of the wild. It was in the quiet understanding that, despite the dangers and hardships, they had mastered an ancient art, one that tied them to the natural world in a way few could ever understand.
Chapter 3: The power struggle between falconer and bird. The falconer's world was one of constant tension and uncertainty. From the moment he stepped outside his quarters in the early hours of the morning, the hunt began, not just for the prey, but for the bird itself. The challenge was not merely to teach a bird to hunt, but to manage its wild instincts, to balance the fierce, independent nature of a bird of prey with the falconer's need for control. It was a delicate dance between the human and the animal, where any misstep could lead to disaster. The falconer was constantly reminded that no matter how much he trained, the bird was always in control of its fate. Unlike horses or dogs, which had been bred for centuries to work alongside humans, falcons and hawks were wild creatures by nature. They were born hunters, capable of taking down prey with a speed and precision that few other creatures could match. But that very wildness, the instinct to be free, to hunt on their own terms, was what made falconry so challenging. The falconer was constantly trying to tame that wild nature, to coax it into cooperation, all the while knowing that the bird could choose to fly away at any moment. It wasn't uncommon for a falconer to lose a bird. Even the most skilled falconers, those who had spent years with their birds, knew the risk of failure. A falcon could simply decide that it no longer wanted to return to its handler, no longer wanted to hunt on command. And once a bird made that decision, there was little the falconer could do to change its mind. The bird might fly for miles, disappearing over the horizon, and the falconer would be left to search for hours, sometimes days, in the hope that the bird would come back. But it was a futile hope. More often than not, the bird would disappear for good, and with it, the falconer's reputation. For a falconer, a lost bird wasn't just a failure. It was a catastrophic event. A falconer who lost too many birds would quickly find himself without work, without a place in the courts of the nobility. But the birds weren't the only source of danger. The falconer's life was filled with risks, from the unpredictable nature of the birds themselves, to the dangerous landscapes they had to navigate. Falconers didn't sit idle in the safety of the castle. They had to travel with the birds, following them as they hunted, moving through dense forests, across rivers, and over hills. They were at the mercy of the terrain, which could be as unforgiving as the birds. One misstep while chasing down a bird could result in a twisted ankle, a fall, or worse. Falconers had to be quick on their feet, constantly aware of their surroundings, whether they were dealing with the bird or the landscape. The environment itself was often just as dangerous as the birds they trained. In the medieval world, the land was not as safe or developed as it is today. Falconers regularly had to navigate rough, rugged terrain, sometimes having to scale cliffs, wade through thick, muddy bogs, or push their way through dense underbrush. The landscapes they moved through were filled with hidden dangers, from wild animals like wolves and boars, to unpredictable weather that could turn a day of training into a life-threatening ordeal. Falconers were often alone, far from the safety of the castle or village, with only their bird and their wits to rely on. While the birds were the primary focus of the falconer's work, they were not the only dangers the falconer faced. The world of medieval falconry was one of constant competition and pressure.
The birds were often a source of pride for the noble families they served, and failure was not tolerated. A falconer who failed to train a bird properly or lost one during a hunt was quickly replaced. The pressure to perform was immense. It wasn't just about keeping the birds in good health or ensuring they hunted well. It was about ensuring that they represented the wealth, power, and status of the noble family. The falconer was responsible not only for the birds but for maintaining the reputation of the lord or lady they served. The falconer was caught in a constant struggle for control. The birds were wild creatures, and while they could be trained to perform certain tasks, they would never be fully under the falconer's command. A falconer could spend hours, days, or even weeks training a bird, but at any moment, the bird might choose to fly away, to refuse to return, or to hunt on its own terms. This unpredictability was what made falconry both exhilarating and terrifying. The falconer could never be certain of the outcome. The bird might perform flawlessly one day, and the next, it might refuse to cooperate altogether. Despite this, the falconer's bond with the bird was undeniable. It was a connection built on trust, one that required both the falconer and the bird to work together in a delicate balance. The falconer needed the bird to hunt, to fly, to return on command. The bird in turn relied on the falconer for food, safety, and companionship. It was a partnership, albeit a fragile one, in which the falconer could never fully control the bird. The best falconers were those who understood the birds, who knew when to push them and when to let them be. They could read the bird's body language, their movements, and their mood. A falconer who could understand the slightest shift in a bird's behavior was one who could keep it under control and guide it through the challenges of the hunt. But even the best falconers faced moments of failure. A falconer who lost a bird or failed to bring back enough prey could be dismissed, replaced by someone who might be luckier or more skilled. The pressure was constant, and it was often overwhelming. The falconer's life was one of sacrifice, where every day was spent balancing the needs of the bird, the demands of the nobility, and the ever-present threat of failure. Even the most successful falconers knew that the next hunt could be their last. The next bird could be their downfall. In many ways, the life of a falconer was defined by uncertainty. Despite the years of training, the deep knowledge of birds and nature, and the bond formed between the handler and the bird, there was always the possibility of failure. The birds were unpredictable, the terrain was unforgiving, and the expectations of the nobility were unrelenting. It was a life lived on the edge, where even the smallest mistake could lead to a lifetime of consequence. The falconer's role, while essential to the noble courts, was also one of the most dangerous and uncertain professions of the medieval world. And yet, despite all of this, falconers persisted. They continued to work with their birds, to face the challenges, to navigate the dangers, and to carry the weight of their reputation with them every day. Their love for the birds, their dedication to the craft, and their understanding of the delicate balance between control and wildness, kept them going, even in the face of constant adversity.
A falconer's life was defined by the constant tension between his mastery over the bird and the bird's untamed spirit. The relationship between the two was never static. It was a daily battle for control, one that was as mental as it was physical. Each day brought with it the potential for triumph or disaster. A falconer could train for months or years, forging a bond that seemed unbreakable. But in an instant, the fragile equilibrium between human and bird could shatter. A falcon, poised and powerful, could turn on its handler in a heartbeat. An angry snap of its beak, a flash of talons, and that delicate connection would be gone, leaving only the remains of what had been. The falconer's job was far from simple. He had to read the birds, understand them as no one else could. They were not like the domesticated animals that served humans in other ways. These birds were wild, fierce, and free, born to hunt and roam the skies. The falconer, in his daily struggle, was not merely teaching a bird to obey. He was convincing it to accept him as an ally, to work with him in a symbiotic partnership that would result in success for both. It was a balancing act of trust, of patience, and above all, understanding. But even the best falconer could be caught off guard. Despite his skill and his knowledge of the birds, the falconer was still at the mercy of the bird's instincts. Falcons were renowned for their precision and speed, capable of diving from great heights to strike down prey with terrifying accuracy.
Yet this same power could be turned against the falconer himself. The falcon in its wild nature could decide to break free from its handler's grasp at any moment. It might soar into the sky following its instincts, flying far beyond the reach of the falconer's call. And when this happened, the falconer was left helpless, watching as the bird disappeared into the distance. No matter how skilled, no matter how carefully trained, the bird could always choose to break free. The loss of a bird was a devastating blow to the falconer. It wasn't just the bird that was lost. It was his livelihood, his reputation, and often his standing at court. A falconer's work was directly tied to the success of his birds. The birds were symbols of power and prestige for the noble families they served. They represented wealth, skill, and control over the natural world. But when a falcon was lost, the falconer became a failure in the eyes of his patrons. The pressure to perform, to ensure that every bird returned safely, was immense. One lost bird could spell the end of a falconer's career. Yet even in the face of these challenges, falconers knew the risks. They accepted that no matter how much training they put into a bird, there would always be the possibility of failure. The unpredictability of nature, the whims of the bird, and the merciless expectations of their noble masters meant that falconers could never afford to relax. They lived on a constant edge, knowing that each day could bring with it a success or a disaster. Their life was one of sacrifice, constant work, unwavering focus, and a constant fear of failure. But there were moments when the bond between falconer and bird could transcend the struggle. These moments were rare, fleeting, and often hard to define. It was in the rare instances when the bird, with its fierce independence, would return to the falconer's arm after a successful hunt. It was in the quiet moments when the falconer could feel the bird's trust, when it would land gracefully on his arm after a long flight, its wings folding with precision. In those moments, the falconer knew that he had earned the bird's respect, that despite the battles and the challenges, they were partners in this ancient art of hunting. And yet the falconer could never fully relax. He knew that the bird could slip from his control at any time. The bird's instincts were always lurking, ready to take over at the slightest provocation. It was a dangerous game, one that required constant vigilance. A falconer could not afford to show weakness. If he did, if he lost his concentration or hesitated for even a moment, the bird would sense it. The bond would weaken, and the bird would once again assert its dominance. Falconry was an art that required more than just skill. It required an understanding of the animal's nature, its instincts, and its unpredictable behavior. The falconer had to become part of the bird's world, to step outside his own human constraints, and see the world through the eyes of a predator. It wasn't enough to command the bird with words or gesture. The falconer had to connect with the bird on a deeper level, to anticipate its movements, its moods, and its desires. Only then could the falconer expect to achieve the perfect flight, the perfect hunt. In the midst of this power struggle, there were moments of the thrill of watching a bird take flight, the rush of air as it soared through the sky, was a reward in itself. The falconer would watch with bated breath as the bird reached the peak of its flight, its wings stretched wide, its eyes scanning the earth below for prey. And when the bird dove, with speed and precision, to strike down its target, the falconer would feel a sense of triumph. It was a shared victory, man and bird, working together to bring down their prey. But even in these moments of success, the falconer knew that the relationship could be broken at any time. The bird could turn on him, refuse to return, or become unresponsive to commands. The tension between them was never fully resolved. It was a constant struggle for dominance, for control, and for the shared understanding that defined their partnership. Yet despite the dangers, the falconer could not help but love the bird. The thrill of the hunt, the bond that developed over years of training, and the pride in watching the bird perform at its best, were rewards beyond measure. And though the risks were great, the rewards were great. The falconer knew that despite the unpredictability, despite the potential for failure, there was nothing quite like the feeling of having a bird soar through the skies under his guidance. In the end, the life of a falconer was one of constant struggle, but it was also one of profound connection. The falconer lived for the moments when his bond with the bird transcended the power struggle, when both man and bird worked in perfect harmony. It was a fleeting, rare victory, but one that made all the hardships worthwhile.
Chapter 4. The Danger of the Hunt. The hunt was where the falconer's skills were tested to their absolute limits. It wasn't just about watching a bird swoop gracefully through the air, it was about navigating a world fraught with dangers both natural and human-made. The medieval landscape was a wilderness in itself. Dense forests, rocky outcrops, deep swamps, and unforgiving cliffs made up the territories the falconer had to traverse, all while managing a bird that could decide at any moment to break free. For a falconer, the hunt was the moment of truth. Everything led up to it, and everything could be lost in a heartbeat. Each morning the falconer would prepare himself, his bird, and the necessary equipment for the hunt. A falconer's attire was simple but critical. He wore leather gloves, often worn and frayed from constant use, and a thick cloak that offered some protection against the elements. The falconer would check his bird, ensuring the jesses, the leather straps used to tether the bird, were secure, and the hood that calmed the bird was removed. Then came the hardest part, the release. It wasn't just about setting the bird free, it was about hoping the bird would respond to the call, hoping that the hours of training would result in a successful hunt. Once released, the bird would take to the sky, its wings slicing through the air, searching for prey. The falconer's role was not over. Now it was a game of observation, patience, and timing. The falconer would watch the bird, his heart pounding as he tracked its every move, its every dive. The falconer had to be prepared to act at a moment's notice, whether it meant giving a signal to the bird or stepping in to protect the bird from predators that could attack from the sky or the ground. But despite all the preparation, things could go wrong quickly. The first danger came from the birds themselves. Falcons, hawks, and eagles were not gentle creatures. They were trained for one purpose: to hunt. They had been bred for speed, strength, and deadly precision, and when they were hunting, their instincts took over. A falconer could direct the bird to a particular area, but once the bird was in the air, there was no way to predict what would happen. The bird might chase down a hare, or it might encounter another predator, an angry eagle, a hawk, or even a larger animal like a wolf. Falconers had seen birds taken from the skies in an instant, snatched by larger, more dangerous creatures. Even the ground could be just as dangerous. The falconer's path would often take him through dense forests or across rocky terrain, each step potentially bringing him into the reach of predators or perilous conditions. Wolves were a constant threat. They could be stealthy, moving through the underbrush, ready to ambush a falconer and his bird. Foxes were another danger, clever and fast. They would attack the falconer's bird if given the chance. The falconer's job was not just to care for the bird but to protect it, and that meant constantly being aware of everything around him. There were also the dangers posed by the hunt itself. Falconers were often called to track their birds across difficult terrain, through mountains, across rivers, and through thick undergrowth. The chase would sometimes lead them to remote places, far from the safety of the castle or village. The bird might be chasing prey and the falconer had to keep up. This was not a simple walk through the woods. It was a race, a relentless pursuit of the bird and the prey. It wasn't uncommon for falconers to climb trees, scale cliffs, or cross ravines to retrieve a bird. A single misstep could lead to injury. It was a job that required both physical stamina and mental sharpness. The falconer had to be quick, both in thought and in action. The terrain itself could be one of the falconer's greatest enemies. Medieval landscapes were not always easily navigable. The forests were dense, the hills steep, and the rivers cold and swift. Falconers would often have to wade through marshes, climb slippery rocks, or crawl through thick underbrush. These were not places for the faint-hearted. If the falconer wasn't careful, a simple slip could result in a broken leg or an injury that would sideline him for weeks. And yet, no matter how treacherous the terrain, the falconer had to press on. A bird that flew too far from the handler could become lost forever. A falconer had to do whatever it took to retrieve it. The hunt was a time when the falconer was truly tested. It wasn't just about his relationship with the bird, it was about his endurance, his knowledge of the land, and his ability to adapt to whatever challenges arose. Every successful hunt brought a sense of triumph, a recognition of the bond between man and bird. The falconer could take pride in the bird's success, knowing that it was his care, his training, and his patience that made it possible. But for every success there was always the possibility of failure. If the bird was injured, or worse, lost, the falconer had to face the consequences. He could not afford to fail.
Even the weather could turn on a falconer during the hunt. Storms could roll in unexpectedly, bringing rain and wind that would ground the birds, making it difficult to retrieve them. High winds could carry a bird far from its handler, making it impossible to call back. It was in moments like these that the falconer's expertise was truly tested. He had to adapt quickly, using the knowledge he had gained over years of working with his birds and his environment. There were no easy solutions in the world of falconry, only quick thinking and the constant pressure to perform. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the hunt was the unpredictability of the birds. Falcons, eagles and hawks were not trained to obey commands blindly. They were wild creatures, bred for their ability to think on their own. A falconer could command his bird to fly in a particular direction, but the bird could ignore him, choosing its own course. This was particularly dangerous when the bird was in pursuit of prey. The falconer had to be ready for anything. If the bird was too aggressive, too focused on the hunt, it could fly too far, refuse to return, or get caught in a tree or a cliffside. The falconer had to be ready to leap into action, to retrieve the bird no matter what the cost. The bond between falconer and bird was always at risk during the hunt. The falconer had to trust the bird, to let it do its work, but he also had to remain vigilant, ready to step in if needed. The bird relied on the falconer to guide it, to call it back when the hunt was over. But there were no guarantees. Falconry was an art of patience and control, but it was also one of constant risk and danger. The falconer had to constantly assess the situation, to anticipate the bird's next move, and to protect it from every threat. In the end, the hunt was a test of both man and bird, and every successful hunt was a small victory in a world filled with uncertainty. The falconer might return to the castle with a fresh kill, a bird that had performed flawlessly, but it was never guaranteed. There was always the chance that the bird might turn, the hunt might fail, or the falconer might lose the trust of the bird entirely. The thrill of falconry came from the constant push and pull between man and nature, between control and freedom. For a falconer, every day brought the possibility of failure, but every successful hunt brought an unmatched sense of triumph.
As the hunt progressed, the falconer's senses sharpened. Every movement, every rustle of leaves, every shift in the wind could be a sign of danger or opportunity. His attention had to be total, and yet, no matter how prepared he was, no matter how finely honed his skills, there was always the chance that something could go wrong. The birds, for all their power and grace, were not always reliable. They could be distracted, driven by their instincts, and falconers had to stay ahead of them, anticipating what they might do next. It was an art of vigilance, one that required the falconer to remain calm under pressure, to act decisively when needed, and to trust in the bond he shared with his bird. The wilderness, with all its beauty, was full of dangers, some visible, others hidden beneath the surface. As the falconer moved through the dense woods, his eyes constantly scanned the environment. Beneath the canopy, the shadows were deep and the ground was uneven, with hidden roots ready to trip up the unwary. Falconers were often alone during the hunt, the vastness of the landscape stretching out before them, with the falcon soaring high above, its keen eyes searching for prey. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it allowed the falconer to focus entirely on his task, on the connection he shared with the bird. But on the other hand, it meant that if something went wrong, if the bird was lost, injured or captured, there was no one to help. It was in these moments of solitude that the true dangers of falconry became apparent. While the falconer was concentrating on guiding his bird, the world around him was alive with threats. Wolves, wild boars and other predators roamed the forests, and a falconer was never far from danger. The bird, focused on the hunt, could easily fall prey to a lurking predator, and if the falconer didn't act quickly enough, his bird could be lost forever. A wolf could tear through the underbrush in an instant, knocking the falcon from the air, while a boar could charge through the trees, its tusks ready to impale anything in its path. The falconer had to be vigilant, keeping an eye on both the bird and the environment around him. His knowledge of the terrain, the wildlife and the behavior of his bird could be the difference between a successful hunt and disaster. The pressure to succeed was immense. Falconers were expected to return with a successful hunt, to bring back the game that their masters had requested. But the wild, unpredictable nature of the birds made it impossible to guarantee success. Even when everything seemed perfect, the weather, the terrain, the birds' training,
there was still the possibility that things would go wrong. The bird might fly off, refusing to return, or it might get distracted by something in the environment. A falconer's heart would race as he watched the bird dive toward its prey, hoping for a successful strike. But no matter how skilled the falconer was, the bird's instincts were always in control. The bird might miss the prey, or worse, it might decide to ignore the falconer's call entirely. The dynamics between falconer and bird were complex, to say the least. The bird was an extension of the falconer's will, but it was also its own creature, subject to its own desires and instinct. It wasn't always easy to maintain the balance. A bird that had been carefully trained might decide one day that it no longer wished to cooperate. It might ignore the falconer's calls, flying further and further away, sometimes even venturing into dangerous territory where it could be lost to predators or bad weather. The falconer, watching helplessly, could only hope the bird would return. But hope was often a luxury in the world of falconry. The falconer had to act quickly, moving swiftly through the terrain to catch up with the bird, often in the most challenging conditions. When a bird was lost, it wasn't just a matter of finding it, it was a matter of survival. A lost bird meant a failed hunt, which in turn meant a falconer who could lose his position, his reputation, and his livelihood. In medieval times, the ability to hunt was a sign of wealth and power. A falconer who failed to perform risked losing favor with his masters, and with that loss, the harsh reality of medieval life would quickly settle in. A falconer could find himself out in the cold, replaced by someone else who promised success. The pressure to succeed was always in the background, even during the moments of quiet observation. When the falconer watched the bird in flight, one wrong move, one moment of distraction, and the falconer could lose everything. Despite these dangers, there was something deeply satisfying about the hunt. When everything went right, the bird took flight, dove toward the prey with deadly accuracy, and returned to the falconer's arm. It was a moment of perfect harmony. The falconer could feel the weight of his bird, its trust, and its power as it landed back on his arm, ready for another hunt. The sense of accomplishment was unmatched. For a brief moment, the falconer had done it. He had conquered the wild, guided the bird through its natural instincts, and brought it back safely. But this satisfaction was fleeting. The hunt was never truly over. The falconer had to constantly work to maintain that bond, to keep the bird trained, and to stay one step ahead of the unpredictable nature of the world they inhabited. The birds themselves were more than just tools of the hunt. They were partners, rivals, and sometimes even enemies. A falconer who knew how to control the bird, who knew its moods and instincts, could have a successful career. But falconry was a fickle art. One failed hunt could ruin a falconer's reputation, and one lost bird could cost him everything. It was a life of constant pressure, with only moments of glory between stretches of grueling work and tension. The falconer had to be both a strategist and a guardian, walking a tightrope between trust and control, between nature and man-made rule. Yet despite the risks, there was something about falconry that drew men into its fold. It was an art that allowed one to feel connected to nature in a way few other professions could offer. The bond between falconer and bird was one of the most profound connections in the natural world. A delicate, fleeting partnership that required sacrifice, patience, and understanding. And in those moments when everything aligned, the bird struck its prey, the hunt was successful, and the falconer returned to the Lord's court with his prize. There was no greater feeling of triumph. The falconer had not only tamed nature, but had become one with it, mastering an ancient art that was as old as civilization itself.
Chapter 5: The Emotional Strain of a Falconer. The falconer's life was defined by an overwhelming emotional strain, one that wasn't immediately visible to outsiders. While the noble families who employed falconers saw only the grace of the birds in flight and the success of the hunt, they rarely witnessed the toll that such a life exacted on the falconer himself. The constant pressure, the long hours, the endless worry over the birds, these things weighed heavily on the falconer's mind. It wasn't just the loss of a bird that caused the pain. It was the mental exhaustion of living on the edge of success and failure, where every day could bring glory or ruin. There were mornings when the falconer woke before dawn, his body sore and his mind already racing with the day's responsibility. He had spent years honing his skills, learning the intricacies of each bird, adapting to the wildness that lay within them. But the effort, while necessary, never seemed enough. The fear of failure was always present, an unshakable companion. What if today was the day the bird flew away? What if it didn't return? The falconer's success wasn't just measured by the prey brought back to the castle. It was measured by the bond he shared with the bird, the trust that existed between them. To lose that trust, to lose the bird itself, was not just a professional failure. It was a deep personal blow. Even in the rare moments of success when the bird performed flawlessly and the hunt was fruitful, the falconer knew the danger was never far away. Every triumph came with the knowledge that another failure was always looming. The birds, despite their loyalty to the falconer, were wild creatures, and the call of the open sky was always there, waiting to pull them away. Falconers lived with the knowledge that no matter how much they trained their birds, no matter how much care and attention they gave them, there was always the possibility that everything could be lost in an instant. This uncertainty was a constant source of anxiety, one that wore down even the most seasoned falconers. But the emotional toll of falconry wasn't just about fear and anxiety. It was also about the deep, quiet attachment that developed between falconer and bird. These creatures were more than just animals. They were companions, partners in the hunt, and in some ways the falconer's only true allies. The bond that formed between the two was one built on trust, patience, and time. The falconer would spend hours with his birds, feeding them, training them, and ensuring they were ready for the hunt. It was a bond that grew over the years, one that became a central part of the falconer's identity. But this bond, like all things in the world of falconry, was fragile. When a bird was lost, the emotional damage was profound. A falconer didn't just lose a bird, he lost a part of himself. The bird, after all, was a reflection of his skill, his dedication, and his connection to nature. Losing a bird meant that something essential had broken in that delicate relationship. It was more than just a missed opportunity, it was a wound to the falconer's pride and spirit. This loss could linger for days or even weeks, haunting the falconer as he went through the motions of his daily life, caring for his other birds, pretending that everything was normal. The mental strain was often hidden behind a stoic exterior, but inside, the falconer was often battling feelings of guilt, frustration, and self-doubt. There was a particular kind of loneliness in this profession, a solitude that went beyond the physical isolation of the job. Falconers were often isolated in remote areas of the estate, away from the bustle of the noble court. The solitude was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it allowed the falconer to focus on his birds, to train them without distraction. But on the other hand, it left the falconer with only his own thoughts for company. The lack of companionship and human connection made it all the more difficult when things went wrong. A falconer could lose a bird, suffer a failure, and have no one to turn to for solace. His job was one of quiet toil, and the weight of his failures often fell on him alone. The mental strain of falconry also came from the constant balancing act that falconers had to perform. They were constantly walking the tightrope between the wild nature of their birds and the expectations of their noble masters. Falconers were expected to deliver results, successful hunts, well-trained birds, and flawless performances. The noble families didn't care about the falconer's struggles or the emotional toll of working with such unpredictable creatures. They only cared about the bird's performance, the number of game birds it brought down, and the success of the hunt. If the falconer failed to meet these expectations, the consequences could be swift and unforgiving. Falconers knew that their positions were precarious, and they lived in fear of being replaced by someone younger, more energetic, or simply more successful. The emotional strain was also compounded by the constant fear of injury. Falconers worked with dangerous creatures, birds of prey with sharp talons and powerful beaks. Even the most docile bird could turn aggressive if it felt threatened or cornered. Falconers were trained to handle their birds with care, to avoid triggering the animal's aggression. But there were times when accidents happened, when a bird in its panic or frustration would lash out. The injuries were often minor, scratches or bruises, but there were times when the damage could be more severe. A talon could puncture the skin, a beak could tear at flesh. Falconers were constantly at risk, not just from nature but from the animals they cared for. And yet despite this danger, they had to maintain their composure, to continue working with the birds, always with the knowledge that the next moment could bring injury or worse. This constant tension between the beauty of the hunt and the emotional toll of the job was something that few understood. Falconers were often seen as quiet, stoic individuals, performing their duties without complaint. But inside, many falconers were struggling with feelings of isolation, fear, and loss. The emotional strain was a silent burden, one that falconers carried with them through every hunt, every training session,
and every day spent with their bird. The rewards of the job, moments of triumph, the thrill of a successful hunt, were fleeting. The emotional cost, on the other hand, was ever present, waiting just beneath the surface. The bond between falconer and bird was one of the most profound relationships in nature. It was built on trust, mutual respect, and the understanding that both man and bird relied on each other for survival. But this bond also came with great emotional costs. The falconer's life was one of constant pressure, where success was fleeting, and failure was never far away. The emotional toll of falconry was as real as the physical challenges, and it was a struggle that falconers faced every day.
The emotional toll of a falconer's life was, in many ways, the silent companion to the physical hardships. It was a quiet, unrelenting burden, one that gnawed at the soul over time. It wasn't just the loss of a bird or the failure of a hunt that weighed heavily on the falconer's mind. It was the constant undercurrent of doubt that ran through his thoughts. The falconer lived in a world of uncertainty, where success was never guaranteed, and failure could come in many forms. Even the most carefully trained birds could falter, and even the most skilled falconer could make a mistake that would cost him dearly. What made the emotional strain even more difficult to bear was the nature of the work itself. Falconry wasn't just about managing birds, it was about living with them, understanding their instincts, and navigating the complexities of a relationship that was far from one-sided. The falconer's bond with his birds was built on years of trust, training, and shared experience. Yet despite the close connection, there was always the possibility that the bird could rebel, could choose to fly away, or could refuse to cooperate when needed most. And when that happened, the falconer was left to face not only the loss of the bird, but the devastating blow to his confidence and his identity as a falconer. For many falconers, this was the hardest part of the job, the knowledge that no matter how much effort they put into their craft, there was always a chance that something would go wrong. The birds were wild at heart, and their instincts were often unpredictable. Even the best trained birds could turn on their handler in an instant. A falconer could spend months, or even years, forming a bond with a bird, only for it to turn its back on him when the hunt arrived. This uncertainty was a constant weight on the falconer's mind, one that could never be fully alleviated. No amount of training, no amount of experience, could eliminate the fear that the bird might slip away, leaving the falconer alone in the wilderness with nothing but his failures. The emotional toll didn't just come from the fear of losing a bird, it came from the isolation that was inherent in the profession. Falconers were often isolated from the rest of the court, working alone or in small groups, far from the revelry of the noble halls. They were servants, caretakers of birds that were symbols of power and prestige, but they themselves were rarely seen as part of the nobility. Falconers worked in the shadows, behind the scenes, while the nobles enjoyed the fruits of their labor. It was a lonely existence, one that was rarely understood by those outside the world of falconry. The falconer was often alone with his thoughts, his fears, and his birds, and when something went wrong, when a bird was lost or a hunt failed, the falconer had no one to turn to for support. The silence of the wilderness became his only companion, and in that silence, the weight of his failure pressed down harder. The isolation was not just physical, it was emotional. Falconers spent long hours with their birds, forming relationships that were both intimate and fragile. These birds were not pets, they were partners in the hunt, and the bond between falconer and bird was one of mutual dependence. The falconer relied on the bird for success, and the bird relied on the falconer for food, shelter, and safety. But that bond was not guaranteed. A falconer could lose a bird not only to a failed hunt, but to a break in that relationship. If the falconer lost the bird's trust, if he was too rough, too impatient, or too distant, the bird might turn away, refusing to cooperate, or simply flying off into the wilderness. For the falconer, this was a blow to his very identity, a deep personal failure that was difficult to recover from. There were few rewards for the falconer in this relationship. While the bird might perform a successful hunt, the falconer rarely received recognition for his role. The nobility enjoyed the prestige of owning trained birds of prey, but they rarely acknowledged the effort that went into training those birds. The falconer's success was measured only by the bird's ability to hunt and return, but even then, that success was fleeting. The falconer had to face the possibility of failure every single day. He could train a bird to perfection, only for it to refuse to follow his commands when it mattered most. Or he could succeed one day, only to lose the bird the next. The lack of recognition was another source of frustration for the falconer. While the noble families were lauded for their ability to keep trained birds of prey, the falconers remained in the background, their efforts largely unnoticed. Falconers didn't enjoy the fame or accolades of knights or courtiers. They were not celebrated for their skill or their dedication. Instead, they were expected to perform without fanfare, to deliver results without complaint. The falconer's work was essential, but it was invisible. The rewards for their labor were few, and the consequences for failure were swift and unforgiving. A falconer who lost a bird or failed in his duties could quickly find himself dismissed, replaced by another with more skill, more luck, or more success. The psychological toll of this constant pressure was immense. The falconer was not just a servant, he was a performer, constantly striving to meet the expectations of his masters. The fear of failure,
the isolation, and the lack of recognition all contributed to the mental strain of the job. It wasn't just about the birds, it was about maintaining the delicate balance between man and nature, between control and wildness. The falconer had to be both a master of his craft and a humble servant to the birds and his noble patrons. He had to navigate the politics of the court while dealing with the unpredictability of his birds, and in the midst of it all, he had to maintain his own sense of self, knowing that failure was always a possibility. Despite the challenges, the falconer continued on, driven by the deep bond he shared with his birds. But the emotional strain was never far from the surface. The joy of a successful hunt, the thrill of watching a bird soar through the sky, was fleeting. The fear of failure, the isolation, and the constant pressure to succeed were always lurking in the background, waiting to weigh him down once again. The falconer's life was one of constant struggle, against nature, against the birds, and against the unrelenting expectations of the nobility. It was a life of quiet sacrifice, where the emotional toll was hidden beneath the surface. And yet, despite it all, the falconer continued to serve, knowing that the bond between him and his birds was something rare and beautiful, something that made the hardships worthwhile.
Chapter 6. The complex training process. In the world of falconry, training was everything. For the falconer, each day was a battle, one that didn't always involve physical combat, but instead required patience, understanding, and a deep connection to the wild spirit of the birds. Every bird was unique, and the falconer had to learn the intricacies of each one. The differences in temperament, the shifting moods, the body language that indicated trust or aggression. To be a successful falconer was to be both a master and a servant. The falconer was not merely training a bird, he was learning how to communicate with it, understanding that his role was to guide, not to control. It was a relationship based on delicate balance, where every action, every gesture, every word mattered. It wasn't enough to simply teach the bird to hunt. The falconer had to teach it to trust him, to accept his presence and follow his lead. And all the while the bird, wild at heart, would be testing the limits of that trust. The first challenge was always the same: getting the bird to accept its handler. A bird of prey bred for hunting was not an animal that could be approached casually. Even the most docile of birds could turn on the falconer in an instant if they felt threatened or confined. Falconers understood this danger. They knew that the first few moments with a bird could make or break the entire relationship. A falconer might spend days or weeks simply sitting beside the bird's perch, letting it get used to his presence. The bird had to learn that the falconer wasn't a threat, that his presence was a part of its environment, not an invasion. This process was slow and painstaking, requiring an incredible amount of patience. But patience alone wasn't enough. The falconer also had to have the skill to read the bird, to understand its body language and its behavior. Every bird was different, and the falconer had to adapt to its unique needs. Once the bird had accepted the falconer's presence, the real work began. Training a bird of prey was not like training a domestic animal. Falcons, hawks, and eagles were not bred for obedience. They were bred for independence, for the ability to hunt and survive on their own. Falconry required coaxing that wild instinct to work in the falconer's favor. This wasn't just about teaching the bird to follow commands. It was about earning its trust, and earning that trust wasn't easy. A falconer had to learn when to be firm, when to be gentle, and when to give the bird space. If a falconer pushed too hard or made a mistake, the bird might refuse to cooperate, or worse, it might turn on its handler. The process of training a bird was a delicate dance, one that required constant attention to the bird's mental and physical state. If the falconer wasn't careful, the bird might become frustrated or fearful, which could lead to aggression. It was easy for a falconer to become caught up in the need for success, to push the bird too quickly in the hopes of seeing results. But falconry was never about rushing. It was a slow, meticulous process that took time and understanding. The falconer had to know when to push the bird to fly, when to allow it to rest, and when to give it a chance to figure things out on its own. The bond between falconer and bird was formed over time, and it was a bond that could easily be broken. The falconer had to be consistent, not just in his actions, but in his approach to the bird. He had to be calm, steady, and confident. If the bird sensed hesitation or fear, it would respond by pulling away, refusing to cooperate. Trust, once broken, was difficult to rebuild. A falconer had to learn how to handle rejection, to accept that not every bird would be easy to train, and that sometimes the bird simply wouldn't respond. This was a hard truth, one that many falconers struggled with. To fail was to lose not just a bird but a part of their own self-worth. But even in the face of failure, the falconer had to persevere. Training a bird to fly, to hunt, and to return on command was a slow process. It wasn't just about teaching the bird how to hunt. It was about teaching it how to work with the falconer.
The falconer had to create a sense of partnership, a relationship where the bird knew it could rely on the handler for food, protection, and guide. It was a relationship that had to be earned, and it was one that the falconer had to maintain every day. The smallest mistake, the slightest misstep, could set back the training process by days or weeks. And even when everything went right, there was still the constant fear that the bird might choose to fly away, to break that bond and return to the wild. The mental strain of this process was immense. A falconer had to be constantly alert, constantly adjusting his approach based on the bird's reactions. He had to be a keen observer, able to detect the slightest shift in the bird's mood or behavior. It wasn't just the bird that had to be trained, it was the falconer too. He had to learn how to read the bird, how to interpret its body language, and how to adjust his own actions accordingly. The falconer had to be prepared for anything, for the bird to refuse a command, for it to fly away, or for it to respond with aggression. Each day was a new challenge, a new lesson in the art of falconry. One of the hardest aspects of training was teaching the bird to return. This was the ultimate test of the falconer's skill, the moment that determined whether the training had been successful. The falcon had to learn to fly, to hunt, and to return to the falconer's arm when called. It was a complex, intricate process that required a deep understanding of the bird's instincts and behavior. And yet, even after months of training, the falconer could never be certain that the bird would return. A bird's loyalty was never guaranteed, and in those moments when the bird refused to come back, the falconer had to face the possibility of failure once again. There was no greater test of the falconer's skill than when the bird was in the air. This was the moment when everything came together, when the bird demonstrated all that it had learned. The falconer's heart would race as he watched the bird fly, its wings cutting through the air with terrifying speed. Every second was a test of trust and training, and when the bird dove to strike its prey, when it returned to the falconer's arm, the feeling of triumph was unmatched. But even in that moment of success, the falconer knew that the bond between him and the bird was still fragile. It only took one mistake, one slip-up, and the entire relationship could fall apart.
The trust between falconer and bird was fragile, built over weeks, months, and sometimes even years of careful interaction. Yet no matter how strong that bond might seem, there was always an unspoken tension, an understanding that the bird could at any time assert its independence and break free. Falconry was a dance between control and surrender, and this balance was always at risk. For the falconer, this meant that every moment spent with the bird was an investment, one that could vanish in an instant. A misstep, an unexpected movement, or a moment of doubt from either party could unravel months of training. Even the best trained birds were not immune to the instincts of their wild nature. The falconer, despite all his experience, was always in a position of uncertainty. He could spend days, even weeks, training a bird to return to his arm, to perform its duties during the hunt. But there were no guarantees. Falconers knew that their success relied not only on their ability to train, but on the bird's willingness to cooperate. And at any moment, that cooperation could be withdrawn. The bird might take flight, and no amount of training, no amount of coaxing could bring it back. This was the cruel paradox of falconry. The more the falconer sought to train and control the bird, the more he had to accept that the bird was always in charge. A falconer's role wasn't that of a master, but rather that of a guide, a protector of the bird, helping it harness its wild instincts to perform within the structured confines of a hunt. But wild creatures are unpredictable, and the falconer was always left with the knowledge that despite all his efforts, he could never truly control the bird. He could only hope to work alongside it. The sense of accomplishment when a bird responded perfectly to the falconer's call and swooped down to strike its prey was unlike any other. In those moments, the falconer felt a rare sense of harmony, a moment when everything aligned, when the bird's instincts were at their sharpest, and the falconer's skills had guided that power to perfection. It was a fleeting triumph, however, one that came with an understanding that it could be undone in the blink of an eye. The relationship was always volatile, a constant balancing act between mastery and submission, between the falconer's desires and the bird's autonomy. A falconer's success in training depended on far more than simply the bird's obedience. It required an understanding of the bird's instincts, an intimate knowledge of its body language and behavior. The falconer had to anticipate the bird's needs, recognizing when it was ready to fly and when it needed rest. He had to understand the subtle cues, the way a bird shifted its weight, the way it tilted its head, the way its feathers ruffled in response to the wind. Every moment with the bird was a test, a delicate negotiation of trust. To fail in that negotiation wasn't just a professional disappointment, it was a personal failure,
But this understanding came with its own set of challenges. Falconers often spent months or even years working with a single bird, carefully teaching it the nuances of the hunt. Each bird was different, and the falconer had to adjust his techniques accordingly. Some birds, particularly those with a wild disposition, required a firm hand, while others thrived under gentler guidance. A falconer had to learn how to read the bird's mood, to adapt to its shifts in temperament. Some days the bird might respond eagerly, diving toward its prey with speed and precision. Other days it might hesitate, taking longer than expected to make its move, or even ignoring the falconer's calls altogether. The falconer's patience was constantly tested, and failure was always a possibility. Even when a bird performed well, when it flew with deadly precision and returned to the falconer's arm after a successful hunt, there was always the nagging thought at the back of the falconer's mind: what if it didn't come back next time? This thought haunted every successful hunt, every moment of triumph. The bird, despite its training, was still a wild creature at heart, driven by instincts that no amount of training could fully control. Falconers had to live with this uncertainty, knowing that the next hunt could be the one where the bird flew too far, where it refused to return, or worse, where it was taken by a predator. The unpredictability of the bird's behavior made training a constant challenge. A falconer might spend hours or even days perfecting a bird's flight pattern, but a single misstep could set the bird back. A shift in the weather, a sudden change in the environment, or even a fleeting distraction could cause the bird to lose focus. The falconer's task was not simply to train the bird to fly, it was to teach it to maintain focus, to understand when to strike and when to return. A falconer had to be both teacher and student, learning from the bird as much as the bird learned from him. And yet, the rewards for a falconer were undeniable. When a bird performed perfectly, soaring through the sky, diving down to catch its prey with lightning speed, and returning to the falconer's arm with the kill, it was a moment of profound satisfaction. The bond between falconer and bird had reached its peak, a moment when both had synchronized into a perfect partnership. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to sustain the falconer through the days of failure, the moments when the bird refused to cooperate, when the hunt ended in disappointment. These moments of success were the ones that kept the falconer going, the ones that made the long hours, the isolation, and the uncertainty worth it. But even in the midst of success, the falconer knew that he could never relax. Falconry was not a profession where one could rest on their laurels. Even after months or years of training, a bird could still break the bond, still refuse to follow the falconer's commands, still decide that it no longer wanted to be part of the hunt. For the falconer, this possibility was always at the forefront of his mind. Every success, every flawless hunt was tempered by the knowledge that the next day might bring a new challenge, a new test of his skills and his bond with the bird. The emotional toll of this uncertainty was immense. The falconer was caught in a constant state of anticipation, never fully at peace, always wondering what the next moment would bring. Even in the rare moments of success, when the bird returned with its kill, and the hunt was deemed a triumph, the falconer knew that this success could be fleeting. The bird might fly away the next day, or the falconer might make a mistake that would cost him dearly. The emotional roller coaster was unrelenting, and it wore down the falconer over time. In many ways, the relationship between falconer and bird was a metaphor for the life of the falconer itself. It was a life of constant uncertainty where success was never guaranteed, and failure was always a possibility. The falconer lived in the shadows of the noble courts, hidden behind the prestige of the birds he trained, constantly working to maintain the delicate balance between man and nature. And though the rewards of the hunt were undeniable, the emotional toll was always present, lurking just beneath the surface.
Chapter 7. The harsh reality of medieval falconry. The life of a medieval falconer, though seemingly steeped in prestige and excitement, was an arduous existence defined by constant struggle. To the untrained eye, falconry appeared to be a noble pursuit, a sport of kings, an art of power and grace. The falconer was seen as a master of birds, guiding majestic predators through the skies, bringing down prey with unmatched precision. But in reality, the falconer's life was anything but glamorous. It was a life of sacrifice, toil and risk, a life where even the slightest misstep could lead to disaster. Each morning, as the first light of dawn crept across the landscape, the falconer awoke, already anticipating the challenges of the day ahead. His quarters were rarely close to the comforts of the noble court. Instead, he lived in modest, sometimes crude conditions, far from the warm hearths of the castle.
His bed, often little more than a pile of straw, was a stark contrast to the luxury enjoyed by the lords and ladies who employed him. The falconer's life was one of solitude, away from the luxuries and pleasures of the court. While others revelled in feasts and social gatherings, the falconer was immersed in the quiet world of birds, his every waking moment devoted to his feathered companions. His mornings began with a ritualistic routine, preparing his birds for the day's hunt. The birds, each unique in temperament and behavior, had to be carefully checked and prepared. Some would need to be fed, while others might require their feathers to be inspected or their jesses adjusted. The falconer knew each bird intimately, understanding the subtle differences in their behavior. For some birds, a gentle touch and calming words would suffice, while others might require a firmer hand. The task was not one that could be completed quickly. It required time, patience, and a deep understanding of the bird's needs. The falconer knew that the slightest error in the care of his birds could result in a day's failure, and so he worked meticulously, preparing his companions for what lay ahead. The first challenge of the day was not just the preparation of the birds, but the challenge of leaving the relative safety of his quarters and venturing into the wilderness. The landscape surrounding the castle was often a dangerous one. Dense forests, rugged hills and swamps that could swallow a falconer whole if he wasn't careful. Falconers spent much of their time in the wild, far from the safety of the castle walls, following their birds across treacherous terrain. The land itself was a foe that had to be constantly reckoned with. Every step could lead to a misstep. Every day could bring a new hazard, whether it was a hidden pit, a wild animal, or the unpredictable weather that could change in an instant. The falconer, with his birds on his arm, had to navigate it all with the greatest care. The hunt itself was a test of skill and endurance. While the birds were the ones doing the hunting, the falconer was responsible for guiding them, ensuring that they stayed on track and returned safely. The falconer had to be constantly alert, watching the birds, watching the terrain, and watching for any signs of danger. The birds, though trained, were not infallible. They could easily get distracted, flying off course or losing focus. A falconer had to stay vigilant, ready to react at a moment's notice, and if the bird flew too far, the falconer had to be prepared to follow it, often through dangerous, unforgiving terrain. But the dangers of falconry went beyond the birds themselves. The falconer's life was one filled with constant threat, from the terrain, from wild animals, and from the very birds he trained. One of the greatest dangers was the risk of injury, a fate that often befell falconers who misjudged a bird's movement. Even the gentlest of birds could lash out when threatened, their sharp talons and beaks ready to strike. Injuries from birds were common, and even a minor wound could end a falconer's career. The life of a falconer was one of constant peril, a life spent on the edge of danger, always one misstep away from disaster. But perhaps the greatest danger came from the birds themselves. For all their grace and beauty, they were still wild creatures. The falconer's job was to manage that wildness, to coax the bird into cooperation. But no matter how skilled the falconer, no matter how well trained the bird, there was always the possibility that something could go wrong. The bird might refuse to cooperate, it might fly off, or it might simply fail to return. In these moments, the falconer was left with nothing but his own frustration and the risk of losing his bird forever. A lost bird was not just a failed hunt, it was a lost investment, one that could mean the falconer's job was in jeopardy. A falconer who lost too many birds could quickly find himself without work, without a place in the court, and without the means to provide for himself. The emotional strain of falconry was often hidden behind the falconer's stoic exterior. Falconers were expected to perform without complaint, to carry out their duties without hesitation. But the mental toll was immense. The pressure to succeed, to maintain the bond with the birds, to keep the noble patrons happy, this was a constant weight that the falconer had to bear. The fear of failure was always lurking, a fear that became even more potent with each passing day. A falconer could spend years training a bird, building a relationship with it, and then lose it in a single moment. The knowledge that this could happen at any time was a silent companion to every hunt, a reminder of the fragility of the falconer's world. But beyond the fear of failure was the loneliness that permeated the falconer's existence. Falconers were often isolated, far from the bustle of the noble courts,
spending days in the wilderness with only their birds for company. The work itself was solitary. Most falconers operated alone, or with a small group of assistants. This isolation was not just physical, but emotional. The falconer had few people with whom to share his successes or failures. The bond with the bird, though deep, was a one-sided relationship. The bird, though a companion in the hunt, was still an animal, driven by instincts that the falconer could never fully control. The falconer's emotional world was shaped by this solitude and the constant uncertainty of his work. The harsh reality of medieval falconry was one that was rarely seen by the nobles who benefited from it. They saw the birds, the elegance of the hunt, and the prestige of their falconers, but they did not see the long hours, the dangers, the failures, and the emotional toll that came with the job. For the falconer, every success was tempered by the knowledge that it could be fleeting. Every day was a new challenge, a new test of skill and endurance. The life of a falconer was not one of luxury or ease. It was a life lived on the edge, defined by constant risk and constant pressure.
As the day wore on, the falconer found himself immersed in the relentless cycle of work. He wasn't simply a caretaker of birds. He was the guardian of their survival, the one who ensured that their instincts were harnessed for the hunt. And as much as the falconer worked to train his birds to bond with them, the underlying reality of the profession remained clear. The wildness of the birds was always a ticking clock. The slightest disturbance, the faintest hesitation, could send the bird spiraling away, slipping out of the falconer's grasp and into the vast wilderness from which it came. The bird, once so carefully trained, could become wild in a heartbeat. A falconer, no matter how skilled, could not completely control the bird's instincts. It was a sobering thought. Falconers knew they were working with creatures that could, at any moment, decide their own fate. The bond that the falconer formed with the bird was both precious and fragile. A bird that flew off into the sky, never to return, was more than just a lost animal. It was a blow to the falconer's very soul. Years of training, months of careful work could vanish in a second. The bond that developed between falconer and bird was not built on control. It was built on mutual respect, a recognition that both were reliant on each other. But this was never guaranteed. The bird, no matter how much it was trained, still had its own desires and instincts. A falconer could only guide the bird, provide it with the tools to hunt, to return and to trust. But the bird was still a creature of the wild with its own will. And that independence, though beautiful, was also dangerous. The wildness of the bird was what made it a powerful hunter, but it was also what made it unpredictable. In a world where success was tied to the bird's loyalty and performance, this constant uncertainty was one of the falconer's greatest challenges. Every day the falconer had to work with that wildness, to coax the bird into returning after a hunt, to encourage it to come back to his arm after it had soared through the sky. The falconer would call to the bird, offering his arm as a perch, but there were no guarantees. Some birds, after a hunt, would return without hesitation. They would glide back to their falconer, landing gently on his arm, ready for the next hunt. But there were others who would hesitate, who would soar farther into the sky, who would at times refuse to return. It was a constant game of patience, a delicate balance between the bird's will and the falconer's skill. Even the most skilled falconers had to face the harsh reality of their work. They could train their birds for years, but they couldn't force them to follow command. It was a profession where success was fleeting, and failure was always lurking around the corner. The falconer's sense of purpose was tied to the birds, but that purpose was fragile. One failed hunt, one lost bird, could bring an abrupt end to a falconer's career. The nobility, who relied on the birds for their sport, did not tolerate failure. Falconers who failed to bring back their birds, who could not meet the expectations of their lords, were quickly dismissed. In a profession where success was measured by the performance of the birds, failure wasn't just a personal disappointment. It was a professional death sentence. The tension between success and failure was palpable, and it hung over the falconer every day. Success in falconry wasn't just about having a trained bird. It was about understanding the bird's needs, instincts, and limitations. A falconer had to know when to push the bird, when to give it space, and when to accept that the bird simply wasn't ready. Every day was a lesson in humility. No matter how much a falconer knew about his birds, there was always something new to learn. A bird's behavior,
its reactions to the environment, its refusal to return. It was all part of the complex nature of falcon. The falconer's job was to guide the bird through this complexity, to make sense of its actions and responses, and to ensure that the hunt went smoothly. But there were no guarantees. One misstep, one moment of distraction, and the bird could be lost. One failure, one missed call, and the bird might choose to fly away, leaving the falconer to face the consequences. The isolation of the falconer's work added to the weight of these challenges. Unlike the knights or nobles who could rely on their wealth, status and social connections, the falconer worked alone, far from the bustling courts where power and prestige were flaunted. He lived on the fringes, his success measured by the success of his birds, his worth determined by his ability to train and maintain them. The falconer's world was one of solitude, of quiet toil in the shadows of the nobility. He was not celebrated for his work, and his failures were often hidden behind the curtain of success. The bird might be seen as a symbol of power and grace, but the falconer, the true artist behind the scenes, remained unseen, his work unacknowledged. Success in falconry for the falconer was always bittersweet. The hunt was exhilarating, but the pressure to succeed, to keep the birds trained and loyal, was unrelenting. The relationship between falconer and bird was complex, defined by a delicate balance of trust and independence. The falconer relied on the bird for success, but the bird was not a servant. It was a creature of the wild, and its nature could never be fully controlled. It could be trained, but it could never be tamed completely. This constant tension between control and freedom was the essence of falconry. It was a profession that required not just physical skill, but a deep understanding of the animal's instincts and behavior. A falconer had to be both a master and a servant, guiding the bird through the hunt, yet accepting that the bird was never fully under his control. Despite the many challenges, falconers continued their work. They faced the dangers, the uncertainties, the emotional toll, and the constant risk of failure. Yet for all the struggles, there was no other life that could compare. The bond between falconer and bird, though fragile, was one of the most profound connections in the natural world. The falconer had to learn to respect the bird's wildness, to accept the risks, and to find satisfaction in the delicate art of guiding these magnificent creatures through the sky. It was a life of constant struggle and constant reward, where the hunt was never guaranteed, but the connection between man and bird was always worth the effort.
Chapter 8. The Cultural Significance of Falconry. The world of falconry was not only about the falconer and the bird, it was deeply entwined with the culture of the medieval elite. While the falconer's life was often a solitary existence, marked by long hours of work and emotional strain, the falcon was a symbol of nobility, wealth, and power. The birds, carefully trained and respected, were more than mere tools for hunting. They were living emblems of status. The falconer, though vital to the success of falconry, was often little more than a background figure in the grand spectacle of the hunt. The nobility who employed him understood the value of the birds in their courtly life, but the falconer's struggle, his constant work and the risks he faced, went largely unnoticed. The nobles who relied on falconers for the training of their birds did so not merely for the hunt, but for the image they projected. To own a falcon, to have trained birds of prey at one's disposal, was a status symbol, an outward expression of power, refinement and control over nature. Falconry was an activity reserved for the elite, a pastime of kings, lords, and those with the means to appreciate its artistry. The falconer's role, while crucial, was often seen as secondary to the spectacle of the birds themselves. When nobles gathered for a hunt, the true focus was on the bird's flight, the prey it brought down, and the glory of the hunt. The falconer's unseen labor was the backbone of this spectacle, but it was rarely celebrated. His work was as necessary as it was invisible. The cultural significance of falconry went beyond the immediate needs of the hunt. It was an art form, a tradition passed down through generations. Falconers were not just caretakers of birds, they were keepers of an ancient skill. The knowledge they carried wasn't simply technical, it was steeped in tradition, history, and a deep understanding of the natural world. The falconer was expected to be both a master of his craft and a guardian of the culture surrounding it. The birds themselves, often passed down from one noble family to another, were not merely tools for survival. They were symbols of the aristocracy's long-standing dominance over both the natural world and the people beneath them. Yet, the falconer's role, despite its importance, was still that of a servant. The falconer existed in the shadow of the nobility, never quite able to break free of the constraints of his position. He lived in the fringes of the court, performing his work without recognition or reward. The noble families who employed him relied on his skill to ensure that their birds performed flawlessly, but they did not see the years of training, the risk, the loneliness, and the emotional toll that came with the job. For them, the falconer was just a means to an end, a tool to ensure that their birds were fit for the hunt. The falconer, no matter how skilled, was always dispensable. If he failed, there was always another who could take his place. This disconnect between the falconer and the nobility was one of the greatest struggles in the life of a falconer. The falconer was entrusted with the birds, the living symbols of noble power, but he was rarely allowed to participate in the grandeur of the hunt. His role was a behind-the-scenes one, marked by quiet toil and constant anxiety. He worked tirelessly to ensure the birds were trained, healthy, and ready to perform at their best, but he did so in isolation, far from the prestige that surrounded his work. The nobles, while fascinated by the spectacle of falconry, seldom understood the sacrifices the falconer made to ensure their success. The pressure on the falconer was immense. Not only did he have to keep the birds in peak condition, but he had to do so while facing constant scrutiny from those who saw falconry as little more than a game of status. The noble patrons who employed falconers had their own interests at heart. For them, falconry was an activity of leisure and luxury, a way to demonstrate their superiority to others. The falconer, however, knew that his success was dependent, not just on the birds, but on the whims of the nobility. He worked to meet their expectations, knowing that failure could mean not just the loss of a bird, but the loss of his livelihood. For the falconer, falconry was not a pastime, it was his life. There was also the issue of competition. Falconers were not alone in their pursuit. Other noble families had their own falconers, each competing for the favor of their lords and the honor of training the most skilled bird. The falconer was always aware of the constant competition, knowing that another falconer might be able to outperform him with better trained birds, faster results, or even a more loyal patron. The fear of being replaced was ever present. It wasn't just about keeping the birds trained, it was about maintaining a reputation. In a world where status was everything, a falconer's reputation could be destroyed in an instant by a single failure. The pressure to succeed, to meet the lofty expectations of his patrons, was enough to drive many falconers to exhaustion. Despite the nobility's reliance on falconry as a symbol of power, it was also a deeply spiritual and philosophical pursuit. Falconers understood the delicate balance between man and nature that falconry represented. The bond between falconer and bird was one that transcended mere utility. It was a relationship that required patience, understanding, and a deep respect for the wild nature of the bird. Falconers knew that they were not masters over the birds, but partners in a delicate dance. The bird's flight, their precision, and their strength were not just tools for the hunt, they were a reflection of the natural world, a world that the falconer was deeply connected to. In this sense, falconry was not just a cultural practice, it was a spiritual one. The falconer's role was to be a bridge between the human and the animal world, guiding the birds to success while understanding that they could never truly be controlled. This deeper understanding of falconry, however, was often lost on the nobility, who saw falconry as nothing more than a form of entertainment. They did not understand the emotional and spiritual connection that falconers shared with their birds. The falconer was not simply a servant or a trainer, he was a steward of a powerful tradition, a guardian of the ancient art of falconry, passed down through generations. But despite this, he was still an outsider, never fully accepted into the world he helped shape. For the falconer, falconry was both a profession and a way of life, a life marked by constant pressure, constant risk, and constant sacrifice. The emotional and physical toll of the job was often unseen by those who reaped the benefits of his labor. Yet, for all the hardships, the falconer's love for the birds never wavered. It was a relationship that, despite its challenges, was defined by a deep sense of purpose and devotion. In the world of falconry, where power and status were ever present, the falconer remained a silent, often invisible figure, bound to the birds he cared for, but forever separated from the prestige they brought.
The power and prestige of falconry were undeniably woven into the fabric of medieval society. For the nobility, falconry was more than just a sport. It was a symbol of authority, an outward display of wealth, power, and mastery over nature. The birds themselves, with their regal beauty and deadly efficiency, represented the nobility's ability to tame and control the wild world. Owning a trained falcon was not simply about the hunt. It was about projecting an image of dominance and sophistication. For the falconer, however, the reality was far from glamorous. They worked tirelessly behind the scenes, often without the recognition they deserved. Falconers were the unseen architects of the aristocracy's outward displays, and yet they lived in the shadows of the court, far from the revelry and wealth that the birds they trained represented. The falconer's life was defined by sacrifice, hard work, and isolation. Though they cared for some of the most prized and powerful creatures in the realm, they were not afforded the same respect as those who owned the birds. To the nobility, the falconer was a mere servant, a tool to ensure that their birds were ready for the hunt. Success in falconry in the eyes of the nobility was measured by the number of birds that returned to their arm after a hunt, the size of the game brought down, and the spectacle of the hunt itself. The falconer's emotional and physical toll, the years spent training and bonding with the birds, was often overlooked. He was not part of the grandeur of the hunt, he was part of the labor that made it possible. But for the falconer, the hunt was far from a mere display of wealth or state. It was the culmination of years of careful training, hard work, and unwavering dedication. The falconer's connection to the birds went beyond the physical. It was a spiritual bond, one rooted in mutual respect and understanding. The falconer had to become attuned to the birds, learning their behavior, their instincts, and their unique personalities. This connection was not forged quickly. It took years of patient training, of quiet moments spent with the bird, of knowing when to push and when to let the bird be. The falconer had to walk a fine line. Too much control, and the bird would rebel. Too little, and the bird might never return. For the bird itself, the hunt was a natural extension of its instincts, and yet it was also an exercise in obedience. A falcon was not simply a hunter, it was a creature of the sky designed to roam freely, to hunt on its own terms. The falconer's job was not to tame that wildness, but to guide it, to direct it toward the success of the hunt. The falconer had to understand the bird's natural impulses and work with them, not against them. This required more than just knowledge of the birds. It required a deep understanding of nature itself, of the delicate balance between man and the falconer was in many ways a mediator between the world of the wild and the world of the aristocracy. The noble patrons who employed falconers were not concerned with the intricacies of this relationship. They saw falconry as a sport, a pastime that allowed them to display their power and wealth. The hunt for them was an opportunity to show off their skill, their control over nature, and their connection to the birds. The falconer, however, knew that it was not simply a matter of control. Falconry was a subtle art that required patience, empathy, and an understanding of the bird's nature. The falconer worked not to dominate the bird but to forge a partnership. He had to respect the bird's autonomy, even as he worked to guide it toward the goals of the hunt. It was this deep understanding, this bond between man and bird, that set falconers apart. They were not just trainers, they were caretakers of an ancient tradition, keepers of a knowledge that had been passed down through generations. The nobility may have seen falconers as mere servants, but in the eyes of those who truly understood the art, the falconer was an essential figure. The falconer was the one who allowed the aristocracy to participate in falconry, to enjoy the power and spectacle that came with the bird. Yet despite their essential role, falconers remained largely invisible, their hard work unacknowledged by those they served. The culture of falconry was steeped in tradition, and this tradition was not one of simple mastery, but of a deep connection to nature and the wild. Falconers were not just workers, they were custodians of an ancient art, one that required not just skill but reverence. They had to understand the land, the birds, and the hunt. They had to know when to step in and when to step back, when to allow the bird to fly free, and when to call it back. It was a delicate balance, one that required both knowledge and respect for the creatures with which they worked. And yet, despite the deep bond between falconer and bird, the work was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. The strain of constant vigilance, the pressure to succeed, and the fear of failure weighed heavily on the falconer. The falconer worked tirelessly to ensure that the birds were ready for the hunt, but he did so at great personal cost. His life was one of constant sacrifice, of long hours,
of physical exhaustion, and of emotional turmoil. The pressure to succeed was immense, and the risk of failure was always looming. In the eyes of the nobility, the falconer was a necessary but invisible figure. His work was taken for granted and his sacrifices were overlooked. The hunt was about the birds, about the spectacle, about the glory of the chase. For the falconer, however, it was about much more than that. It was about a deep connection to nature, to the birds, and to the ancient traditions of falconry. It was about understanding the wild, about living with it, and about guiding it towards success. It was a life of constant effort, constant risk and constant reward, one that required both patience and perseverance, but also a profound respect for the creatures that made it all possible.
Chapter 9. The fleeting moments of success. The life of a falconer, though marked by constant struggle and uncertainty, also had its moments of triumph. Fleeting, rare, and difficult to hold on to. These moments were hard-won, often the result of countless hours of patience, training, and sometimes sheer luck. For the falconer, success was never guaranteed, but when it arrived, it was a fleeting, exhilarating experience. A bird returned from a successful hunt, perched proudly on the falconer's arm, with the blood of its prey still fresh in its claws. It was a moment that made all the struggles worthwhile, a reminder of the deep connection between man and nature, of the skill required to guide a wild creature to such precise action. But even in those moments of success, the falconer knew that it was temporary. The birds, no matter how skilled, were still unpredictable. They were wild creatures at heart, capable of defying the falconer's will in the blink of an eye. The bond between falconer and bird was fragile, and while it might feel strong in the moment, it was always at risk of breaking. A bird that returned after a successful hunt might refuse to do so the next time. The pressure to maintain this bond was constant, and the fear of losing it was always present. The falconer's life, despite the occasional success, was one of emotional turmoil. Each hunt was a test, and every bird's flight was a gamble. The stakes were high, and the consequences of failure were severe. The joy of success was often quickly followed by the dread of failure. A falconer who had just experienced the thrill of a successful hunt could easily find himself in a moment of despair the next day when his bird refused to return. A falconer who had spent weeks training a bird to hunt with precision could find himself, the very next day, losing that bird to the wild, with no way of knowing whether it would come back. It was a constant cycle of hope and despair, where every success was followed by the knowledge that the next moment could bring failure. The emotional toll of this constant up and down was significant. The falconer had to remain focused, always ready for the next challenge, always striving to maintain the bond with the bird, while also acknowledging that it could all slip away. The birds, despite their grace and beauty, were creatures of the wild. They had minds of their own, and they could never be fully controlled. The falconer had to be prepared for this, to accept that at any moment, the bird might choose to break the bond and fly away. This reality was one that falconers lived with every day, and it weighed heavily on them. It was a quiet anxiety that accompanied every hunt, a fear that despite all the training, all the care, the bird might refuse to return, or worse, might be lost to the wild. The bond between falconer and bird, though strong, was never entirely secure. The falconer could spend hours, days, even years training a bird, building trust, and developing a working relationship. But in an instant that bond could be broken. A bird could be spooked, distracted, or simply decide to fly away. For the falconer, this was one of the greatest fears, a fear that kept him on edge every day. The bird might be perfect one day, and unresponsive the next. The falconer had to remain adaptable, always adjusting his approach to the bird's changing moods and needs. The success of the hunt was always uncertain, and that uncertainty was a constant source of mental strain. Even in the moments of triumph, when the bird had returned with its prey and the falconer's efforts had been rewarded, there was always the lingering fear that the next hunt might end in failure. The complexity of the relationship between falconer and bird was part of what made falconry so fascinating, and yet so mentally exhausting. It was a relationship based on mutual understanding, but one that was always on the edge of breaking. The falconer could never be fully confident that his bird would always respond, always return. The bird, for all its training, was still a wild creature, and that wildness was something the falconer could never fully tame. It was this tension,
the tension between control and freedom, between trust and independence, that defined falconry. The falconer had to respect the bird's autonomy while also guiding it towards success. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant attention and vigilance. But despite all the emotional strain, there were moments of pure joy. The thrill of watching a bird take flight, to see it soar into the sky with incredible speed and precision, was unmatched. The falconer would watch with bated breath as the bird searched for prey, its sharp eyes scanning the landscape below. And when the bird spotted its target and swooped down with deadly accuracy, the falconer could feel a sense of triumph. It was a moment of perfect harmony, a moment when man and bird were in sync, working together in a way that few others could understand. The bond between falconer and bird was at its strongest in those moments of success, when the bird returned to the falconer's arm, victorious in its hunt. Yet, even in these moments, the falconer knew that success was not guaranteed. The next hunt could be different. The bird could fly too far or refuse to return. The falconer had to accept that every moment of triumph was fleeting, that every victory could be followed by defeat. The knowledge of this impermanence made the moments of success all the more precious. The falconer lived for these moments, even if they were rare. In a life defined by uncertainty, the feeling of success, of watching the bird perform flawlessly, was a reward that made the struggle worth. However, for the falconer, the price of this success was high. The emotional and physical toll of the job was unrelenting. Every day was a test, every hunt a new challenge. The falconer had to live in a constant state of readiness, always anticipating what the next moment would bring. The fear of failure was always present, lurking in the background, but so too was the hope for success. Falconers lived in a world where failure and triumph were always one step apart. Success was fleeting, but it was enough to keep them going. Every hunt, every bird returned safely, was a reminder that their work was not in vain. But the pressure was constant, and the mental strain never let up.
Chapter 10. The Unseen Hero of the Hunt. In the grand spectacle of the hunt, the falconer was often relegated to the role of the unseen hero, while the noble patrons basked in the glory of the chase. Celebrating the precision of the birds as they dove from the skies, the falconer remained in the shadows, working tirelessly to ensure the birds performed at their peak. The falconer was the architect behind every successful hunt, yet his efforts were rarely acknowledged. The aristocracy reveled in the luxury and spectacle of falconry, but for them it was never about the falconer. It was about the birds and the grandeur of the chase. The falconer's role was essential, but his labor was invisible. The truth was that the falconer was the backbone of the hunt, the silent guardian of the birds who made it all possible. But for all the skill, patience and dedication the falconer poured into his craft, his value was often measured solely by the performance of the birds. If the birds returned from the hunt with the kill, the falconer was praised. If they failed, the falconer was blamed. There was little room for understanding, little recognition of the emotional and physical toll of the profession. The noble families who employed falconers were far more interested in the power and prestige that falconry brought than in the struggles of the men who made it possible. This reality weighed heavily on the falconer. He was caught in a paradox. He was indispensable, yet invisible. He lived for the moments when his birds soared into the sky, when they captured the prey and returned to him with their pride. But he also lived with the constant fear that the birds might not return, that he might lose everything in a single moment. His worth was tied to the success of the hunt, and in a world where status and prestige were everything, failure was not just a professional setback, it was a loss of identity, a loss of place in the very society he served. For the falconer, success was never truly his own. Even when his birds performed flawlessly, it was the lords and ladies of the court who received the accolades. They were the ones who stood tall, proudly displaying their falconry prowess. They were the ones who reaped the benefits, who basked in the admiration of their peers. The falconer, meanwhile, remained a silent figure, working in the background, knowing that the birds were not his to keep. He could train them, he could guide them, but in the end they belonged to the nobility. The falconer's relationship with the birds was a complex one. He was not their owner but their caretaker, their trainer, their guard. He lived in constant service, always ensuring that the birds were ready for the next hunt, always maintaining the delicate bond that allowed them to soar with such deadly grace. This sense of duty was one of the driving forces in the falconer's life. Despite the emotional toll, despite the risk and uncertainty that marked every day, the falconer's devotion to his craft never wavered. He understood the importance of his work, the prestige that falconry brought to the aristocracy,
and the role he played in maintaining that image. The hunt was not just about the birds, it was about the noble families, their wealth, and their status in society, and the falconer was the one who ensured that the hunt would go smoothly, that the birds would perform at their peak. But his contributions, despite their significance, were rarely acknowledged. The falconer knew that his value was not measured in praise or recognition. His work was a silent labor, a quiet contribution to a world that saw falconry as a symbol of power and dominance. The emotional toll of this invisibility was profound. Falconers spent long hours with their birds, nurturing them, training them, and forging bonds of trust. They understood the birds better than anyone else, but their connection was rarely seen by the very people who benefited from it. For the falconer, success in falconry was a solitary pursuit. He spent countless hours working with the birds, fine-tuning their training, making adjustments, and ensuring that the birds were fit for the hunt. He did so in isolation, far from the social events and gatherings that the noble families enjoyed. And while the falconer understood that his work was essential, he also knew that his efforts would often go unnoticed. The birds were the stars of the show, not the falcon. In the midst of this, the falconer found solace in his bond with the birds. They were not just tools for the hunt, they were partners in a delicate, unspoken relationship. The falconer guided them, cared for them, and nurtured them, but he also understood that the birds were creatures of the wild, driven by instincts that no amount of training could fully tame. It was this wildness, this independence that made the birds so powerful, and it was this very wildness that the falconer had to respect. The falconer understood that his role was not to dominate the bird, but to work alongside it, to guide it with care and patience. This partnership was the heart of falconry, and it was a bond that transcended the material rewards of the hunt. But the bond between falconer and bird was fragile. The birds, no matter how trained, still had the capacity to reject their handler's guide. They could fly away, refusing to return, or they could become disobedient, ignoring the falconer's calls. For the falconer, this was a constant source of anxiety. A bird that refused to return was not just a lost asset, it was a personal failure. It was a blow to the falconer's pride, a reminder that despite all the training and care, the bird was still a creature of the wild, subject to its own instincts. This was the harsh reality of falconry. The falconer could guide, he could train, but he could never fully control. The birds had minds of their own, and no amount of training could completely change that. This uncertainty, this unpredictability, was what made falconry both exhilarating and terrifying. The falconer's life was a constant balancing act between trust and control. He had to trust the birds, but he also had to maintain control over them, ensuring that they returned after the hunt, ensuring that they performed when needed. And when the bird failed to return, when it was lost, it wasn't just the falconer's reputation that was at stake, it was the falconer's sense of self-worth. The falconer's identity was tied to the birds, and when the birds failed, so did he. In a world where status was everything, failure in falconry could mean the end of a career, the loss of a place in the court, and a lifetime of work undone.
As the falconer continued his work, day after day, his existence became defined by the grind of routine and the pressure to perform. His life was not just about preparing the birds for the hunt or ensuring that each bird was fit and healthy. It was also about the internal battle between what he was expected to do and what he could realistically achieve. There was an unspoken expectation in the courts. The falconer's birds must always return after the hunt, must always perform flawlessly, and must always be at their best. This constant demand for perfection weighed heavily on the falconer's shoulders. For him, each successful hunt was a temporary victory in a world that was constantly moving, constantly demanding more. He had little room for complacency. The nobles did not care about the sacrifices that went into training the birds. They only cared about the results, about the birds' ability to hunt and return, and the prestige they brought to the court. It was in this environment that the falconer worked, performing his duties quietly, often without recognition. The bond between the falconer and the birds was something few could understand, but it was the very thing that sustained him. The birds, though wild and unpredictable, were not just his tools for hunting, they were companions. They were living creatures that he had nurtured, trained, and cared for. His entire existence revolved around their success. The emotional strain of constantly striving for that success was immense. The falconer's role was one of constant vigilance and preparation, knowing that the birds could fail to perform, could decide not to return, or could be lost to the wild in an instant. Every day the falconer would start his routine before dawn. The birds needed to be prepared for the hunt, fed, checked for injuries, and mentally primed for the day ahead.
Some birds were easier to work with than others. Some falcons were naturally calm and obedient, responding well to the falconer's cues. Others were more temperamental, wild at heart, resistant to the falconer's guidance. These birds required more time, more patience, and a deeper understanding of their behavior. It was not just about training them to hunt. It was about gaining their trust, proving that the falconer was worthy of their cooperation. But no matter how much effort the falconer put into the training, there was no guarantee that the birds would always follow his command. This was the heart of the falconer's struggle, the wildness of the birds, their instinctive need for independence, and the uncertainty of whether that bond would hold. The birds were not the only challenge the falconer faced. The environment itself was often just as dangerous. The hunts took place in forests, over mountains, across vast stretches of open land, where anything could happen. A falcon might chase prey into a dense thicket and become trapped, or it might fly too far, leaving the falconer to track it across treacherous terrain. In these moments, the falconer was forced to push his body to its limits, climbing cliffs, crossing rivers, or wading through swamps to retrieve the bird. The physical strain of chasing down a bird, sometimes for miles, often took its toll. The falconer had to be fit and agile, able to navigate difficult terrain and deal with the elements. But even the most skilled falconer could not predict what would happen once the bird was in flight. The risks were part of the job, and the falconer had to accept them, knowing that each hunt carried with it the possibility of failure. But the dangers weren't just external. The falconer had to contend with the emotional toll of his work. His identity, his self-worth, was tied to the birds and their success. If a bird failed to return, if it was lost to predators, or if it refused to follow the falconer's commands, it was more than just a professional setback. It was a personal blow. The falconer felt the weight of his failures deeply. A lost bird was not just a failure in the eyes of the noble family he served. It was a reminder that despite all his training, all his effort, he was never fully in control. The bond between falconer and bird, fragile as it was, could break in an instant, and the falconer was always left wondering if there was something more he could have done. He questioned his own abilities, second-guessing himself in a profession where self-doubt was a luxury he could not afford. The pressures were compounded by the ever-present threat of being replaced. Falconers, like the birds they trained, were replaceable. If they failed too often, if their birds did not perform, the noble families would quickly turn to someone else. A falconer's career was always hanging by a thread, dependent on his ability to deliver. The competition was fierce, and falconers were constantly vying for positions, hoping that their birds would be the ones to impress the lords and ladies of the court. The fear of failure, the fear of losing his place in the court, was always present in the back of the falconer's mind. He knew that success in falconry was fleeting, and failure often meant the end of his career. Despite all this, falconers found moments of joy in their work. There were the rare, beautiful moments when the birds performed perfectly, soaring into the sky, diving toward their prey, and returning to the falconer's arm with the catch. These were the moments that made the long hours of training, the emotional strain, and the physical risks worth. They were fleeting moments of triumph, but in those brief seconds, the falconer knew that his work had been worth every sacrifice. For the falconer, these moments were more than just a sign of success. They were a validation of the bond between man and bird, a reminder of the delicate balance between control and freedom. But even in these moments of success, the falconer could never fully relax. There was always the fear that the bird might fly too far, might refuse to return, or might become lost to the wild. Falconry was a profession of constant vigilance, where every hunt, every bird, every day brought new challenges. The falconer's work was never done. Even in the quiet moments of rest, the falconer was always preparing for the next hunt, always thinking about the next bird, the next opportunity to prove himself. The cycle of success and failure was relentless, but the falconer had no choice but to continue, to push forward, to maintain his place in the world of falconry. The world of falconry, despite its prestige, was one of constant pressure and uncertainty. For the falconer, the reward was not in the admiration of others, but in the quiet satisfaction of a successful hunt, the understanding that his bond with the birds had been strengthened. But that bond was fragile, and the pressure to maintain it was immense. The falconer lived in a world of constant risk, where failure was always just around the corner, but so too was success. It was a life of extremes, a life defined by the hunt, by the birds,
and by the emotional and physical toll that came with the pursuit of perfection.
Chapter 11: The Cost of Failure. The price of failure in the world of falconry was steep, and the emotional cost was often more crushing than the professional. A falconer's life was built upon the delicate balance of training, trust, and understanding. It was not just the physical labor of caring for the birds or the long hours spent in the field. It was the deep emotional investment that went into every moment spent with the birds. This bond was what made falconry more than just a job. It was a way of life. The falconer's success was intertwined with the performance of his birds. The nobility who relied on him had little understanding of the effort required to train and manage these wild creatures. For them, the hunt was a symbol of their power and prestige, and the falconer was simply the means to an end. But for the falconer, the hunt was a deeply personal pursuit, marked by every failure and every success. To the nobles, a failed hunt was a mere inconvenience. It was a day wasted, a loss of face, and perhaps a mark on their reputation. To the falconer, however, it was a personal defeat, one that threatened not only his livelihood but his very identity. A lost bird wasn't just an animal gone astray, it was a failure of his ability, a crack in the bond he had worked tirelessly to build. The pressure to perform, to bring back successful hunts, was constant, and failure meant not just a missed opportunity, but the risk of being replaced. A falconer who failed too often was quickly cast aside, his reputation tarnished, his place in the noble court lost. The emotional toll of this pressure was immense. Every day spent in the wilderness with the birds was a test of the falconer's skill and patience. The birds, for all their training, were still wild at heart. They could fly away at any moment, breaking the bond between falconer and bird, leaving the falconer to face the consequences. Even a single failure could lead to the falconer's downfall. The world of falconry was not one where second chances were readily given. The falconer was expected to be perfect, to ensure that the birds always performed as expected, no matter the circumstances. The mental strain of this expectation was constant. The falconer had to walk a tightrope, balancing the bird's needs and instincts with the demands of his noble patrons. For the falconer, failure was never just a minor setback. It was a blow to his pride, a reminder of his vulnerability in a world where perfection was expected. He knew that every hunt was a gamble, every bird a potential loss. The fear of failure hung over him like a cloud, and when a bird failed to return or a hunt went awry, the emotional weight was almost unbearable. He would spend hours, sometimes days, searching for the lost bird, hoping against hope that it would return. But often, the bird would not come back, leaving the falconer with nothing but his failure. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, and it was compounded by the knowledge that the nobility had little patience for such setbacks. The worst part of failure was the isolation that followed. Falconers worked in relative solitude, far from the bustling courts where the nobles enjoyed their leisure. They spent their days in the wild, alone with their birds, their thoughts, and the constant pressure to succeed. The success of the hunt for the noble families was a grand spectacle, but for the falconer it was a solitary pursuit. He had few people to share his triumphs with, and even fewer with whom he could share his failures. The bond between falconer and bird was profound, but it was also one that could never truly replace human connection. The emotional toll of working alone, of carrying the weight of the hunt without recognition, was a struggle that few outside the falconer's world could understand. Failure in falconry wasn't just about losing a bird or failing to bring down prey. It was about losing the trust of the bird, losing the bond that had been carefully built over time. This was the true cost of failure, the emotional distance that grew between falconer and bird. A bird that refused to return, a bird that broke the bond, was a devastating blow. It wasn't just about the bird itself, it was about the falconer's sense of self. His worth was measured by the bird's success, and when the birds failed, so did he. The loss of a bird was a reflection of his failure as a falconer, and the burden of that failure could be crushing. Yet, despite all the pressure, despite the constant fear of failure, the falconer found moments of solace in his work. The bond between man and bird, though fragile, was one of the most unique and profound relationships in the natural world. When the bird returned after a successful hunt, when it perched on the falconer's arm, victorious and graceful, it was a reminder that the struggle was worth it. The bird, for all its wildness, had chosen to return. It had trusted the falconer, had followed his guidance,
and had worked in partnership with him to secure its prey. These moments were rare, fleeting, but they were enough to sustain the falconer through the long days of failure and disappointment. The falconer's life was a life of constant struggle, a life defined by the delicate balance between success and failure. Every day was a test of skill, patience, and emotional resilience. He had to fight not just for the bird's success, but for his own survival in a world where failure was never truly tolerated. The fear of failure was always lurking, but so too was the possibility of success. In the rare moments when everything went right, when the birds performed flawlessly, when the hunt was a success, the falconer could take pride in his work, in the deep bond he had forged with the birds, and in the artistry of the hunt. But even these moments were fleeting, and the falconer knew that the next hunt, the next bird, could be his downfall.
As the sun set on another long day in the wild, the falconer found himself standing alone, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. The hunt had not gone as planned. His bird, which had shown such promise, had flown off into the distance, disappearing into the horizon. It had been a perfect moment, a bird poised to strike. The falconer's heart filled with anticipation, but then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The falconer had called to it, shouted for it to return, but it did not. It simply kept flying, free as it had always been. The bird was not just a companion or a tool. It was part of him. It had been a reflection of his skill, his patience, and his ability to build trust. And now it was gone. The falconer felt the sting of failure deeper than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about the bird, it was about him, about the very essence of his profession. He had failed in his most fundamental task, to keep the bird loyal, to guide it through the hunt, to ensure it returned. As the falconer made his way through the rough terrain, searching for any sign of his bird, the isolation of his profession hit him harder than ever before. He walked alone through the wilderness, the weight of his failures echoing in every step. There was no one to turn to for comfort. The nobles he served were likely already preparing for the next hunt, their expectations high, their patience thick. The falconer, on the other hand, knew the truth, that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much care and effort he put into his birds, there would always be the possibility of failure. He could spend years training a bird, developing a bond, only for it to break free, to leave him with nothing. The emotional toll of falconry was not something that could be easily understood by those who stood on the outside watching the birds in flight. The falconer lived with this uncertainty every single day, and yet, despite the isolation, despite the failure, the falconer's love for the birds never wavered. Even in his darkest moments, when the weight of the world seemed too much to bear, he understood that this bond, this partnership between man and bird, was something unique, something worth fighting for. There was no other profession that offered the same depth of connection to nature, to the wild. The falconer's life was defined by this relationship, and it was something he could never walk away from. As the days passed and the falconer continued his search, he realized something deep within himself. Falconry was not just about success, it was about the struggle, the constant effort to maintain that bond, to work with the birds, to understand their wildness, and guide them through it. Failure was inevitable, but it didn't define him. The work, the bond, the connection, that was what mattered. The birds would never be fully controlled, and that uncertainty was a part of their power. But the falconer, too, was powerful in his own way. His strength lay not in dominating the birds, but in understanding them, in working with them, in earning their trust. Eventually the falconer found his bird again. It was perched high in a tree, tired and weary, but still alive. The bird looked down at him with recognition, with a sense of understanding. The falconer approached slowly, carefully, not wanting to frighten it away again. He extended his arm, his heart racing with anticipation. The bird hesitated for a moment, its sharp eyes scanning him, but then, as if sensing the bond between them, it flew down and landed gently on his arm. In that moment the falconer felt a surge of relief, of triumph, not because he had succeeded in bringing the bird back, but because the bird had chosen to return. The bond between them had been tested, and it had held strong. Despite the failure, despite the risk, despite the uncertainty, the connection between falconer and bird had endured. The falconer understood that this moment, this brief moment of success, was all he could ask for. It was the reason he did this work, the reason he continued to sacrifice, to push through the emotional toll,
to face the constant risk of failure. As the falconer made his way back to the castle, the bird perched on his arm. He realized that falconry was never truly about perfection. It was about the journey, the effort, the understanding, the bond between man and animal. It was about learning from failure and embracing the unpredictability of the natural world. Falconers lived in a world of constant uncertainty, but it was that uncertainty that made the moments of success so precious. Every bird that returned, every hunt that went smoothly, was a reminder of the deep connection between falconer and bird. The falconer knew that the work would never be easy, that the challenges would always be present, but he also knew that the bond he shared with the birds was something that could not be replaced. The fleeting moments of success were enough to sustain him, to remind him that despite the failures, despite the isolation, his work was meaningful. It was a life defined not by the bird's success, but by the relationship he had with them. It was a life of struggle, but also a life of profound connection. The falconer walked back to the castle, the bird still perched on his arm, a quiet smile playing on his lips. It had been a hard day, a day of failure and fear, but it had also been a day of triumph, a day when the bond between man and bird had survived, and a reminder that success in falconry and in life was never about perfection. It was about persistence, patience, and the understanding that failure was not the end, but just another part of the journey.
And so the falconer's life continued, an endless cycle of struggle, perseverance, and fleeting moments of triumph. His was not a life of glory, not one filled with grand gestures or accolades, but it was a life rich with purpose. In the silent spaces between hunts, in the moments spent tending to his birds, the falconer found meaning. It was a life defined by trust and vulnerability, by the wildness nature and the quiet discipline of the human spirit. For the falconer, success was never measured by the prey brought down or the birds that returned. It was found in the connection he nurtured with the creatures he cared for, the bond that allowed them to soar through the skies, side by side. Each hunt, each moment spent in the company of his birds, was a reminder that falconry was not just a profession. It was a reflection of the delicate balance between control and freedom, trust and independence. The falconer's story is one of quiet resilience, where failure is never the end, but a part of the journey. It is a story of understanding, of recognizing that the wildness of the birds is not something to be tamed, but something to be respected. His life is a testament to the idea that success is not always about perfection, but about the persistence to continue to rebuild, and to honor the bonds we share even in the face of uncertainty. As the falconer walks alone with his bird perched on his arm, the sun setting behind him, he knows the hunt will continue. The challenges, the risks, the sacrifices, they are all part of the journey. But so too are the moments of connection, the brief flashes of success that make it all worthwhile. In the world of falconry, as in life, there is no true end, only the next hunt, the next bird, the next bond waiting to be forged in the skies. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to The Drowsy Historian for more historical tales and deep dives into the past. Until next time, may your journeys be full of discovery, even in the quietest moments.